Hello everyone. Welcome back to the channel. My name is Zayden, and if you are new here, welcome. I'm so glad you found this place tonight. Pull your blanket a little closer, turn the lights down low, and get comfortable, because tonight, I have 3 hours of true disturbing horror stories that are going to stay with you long after this video ends. These are not made-up tales. These are accounts sent in by real people. People who were going about their ordinary lives when something stepped out of the dark and changed everything. But before we begin, let me give you something to think about. A man drove the same highway route every single week for 11 years. He picked up the same woman every Friday at exactly 2:13 in the morning, and one night he finally asked her where she lived, and she told him he already knew. He had been driving past her grave for over a decade. That is the kind of story we have tonight. Are you ready? Before I begin, I can already see that around 80% of you watching right now have not subscribed to this channel yet, and if you are enjoying these stories, please take 2 seconds and hit that subscribe button. Leave a like, click the bell icon so you never miss a new video, and drop a comment right now telling me where in the world you are watching from. What time is it there? I genuinely love reading every single one of those comments. It means so much more than you know. And if you have your own story, something that happened to you, something you witnessed, something you cannot explain, please email us or leave it in the comments. Your story could be the next one read on this channel. Now, let us begin. Story 1. The Last Passenger. She was already standing there when the bus came around the corner. Every single Friday night, at exactly 2:13 in the morning, she was waiting at the same spot on the coastal highway, just beyond the reach of the nearest street light, standing completely still, not looking at her phone, not shifting her weight the way people do when they are cold and tired and waiting in the dark. Just standing. His name was Daxton, and he had been driving the Route 11 overnight bus for 11 years. He was 43 years old, a careful man, methodical, the kind of driver who always filled in his logbook in full and never took shortcuts on his walk-through checklist. He had seen everything you could imagine on a night route, passengers who got on drunk and fell asleep past their stop, couples arguing in hushed furious voices in the back rows, a man once who had somehow brought a live bird in a cardboard box and seemed genuinely surprised when Daxton asked him to get off. But in 11 years, he had never seen anything that made him feel the way this woman made him feel. She wore the same thing every week. A pale gray dress that reached her ankles, long sleeves that covered her wrists completely. Her dark hair hung loose around her face in a way that always seemed slightly damp, even on clear dry nights when there had been no rain for days. She never made eye contact when she climbed the steps. She dropped her coins into the fare machine without speaking and without looking up, and she always walked to the very back of the bus and sat in the left window seat, the last row, directly above the rear axle. Daxton had invented explanations for her over the years. She worked night shifts at one of the big distribution warehouses on the edge of the industrial estate. She was a woman leaving a bad situation and keeping odd hours to avoid someone. She was simply a quiet person who valued her privacy and had no obligation to explain herself to a bus driver. Any of those explanations were reasonable. Any of them could have been true. But she never got off the bus. He watched for it every week in the rearview mirror, the hospital stop, the harbor district, the old mill road, the industrial estate junction. Passengers would stand and pull their coats on and shuffle down the aisle and disappear into the dark one by one. But she was never among them. She sat in that last left seat with her face turned toward the window, and she was still there when the bus reached the second to last stop. And then she was not. He had tried once to stay aware, to keep an eye on the mirror without making it obvious. But the moment he glanced away for even a few seconds to navigate a turn or check the road, she was simply gone. The seat would be empty, the aisle clear, the bus doors still closed and the door indicator light on his dashboard still showing green. She had never triggered the door release. He started keeping a written passenger count after the 3rd year. He would note the number of people who boarded at each stop and compare it to the number who alighted. The numbers never balanced on the nights she was on the bus, because no matter how carefully he counted, he could never quite bring himself to count her. She existed outside his tally in a way he could not logically explain. On a cold and foggy night in late October, Daxton made a decision. He waited until the last other passenger, a tired older man in a waterproof jacket who smelled faintly of machine oil and always got off at the industrial estate, had shuffled down the steps, until the bus was entirely empty except for himself and the woman in the back left seat, until the fog coming in off the coast was thick enough that the highway lights were ringed with orange halos and the world outside the windshield had shrunk to 50 yards in every direction. And then he spoke. He kept his eyes on the road and said, in a clear and measured voice, "Excuse me, miss. I hope you don't mind me asking. I've been driving this route a long time, and I've seen you here every Friday for years. I was just wondering, where exactly are you headed tonight?" Silence. He glanced up into the rearview mirror. She was looking at him. He nearly swerved. He had never seen her face fully before. Her hair had always been across it. But now she was looking directly at him in the mirror with an expression that was not hostile or frightened or even particularly surprised. Just attentive. Her skin was very pale, almost the same color as the fog outside, and her eyes caught the interior light of the bus in a way that seemed wrong, too bright, too still, like the eyes in an old photograph. She said nothing for a long moment, and then she said, in a voice so quiet and so close that he could not account for how clearly he heard it over the engine noise, "You already know where I live." Daxton felt the cold move up the back of his neck. He said, "I don't think I do." She said, "You drive past it every week." He looked back at the road. He concentrated on the white line at the edge of the lane. He breathed carefully and slowly. He told himself to stay rational. He counted 10 seconds and looked in the mirror again. The seat was empty. He pulled the bus over on the hard shoulder and sat without moving for 3 full minutes. The door indicator light was green. It had been green the entire time. The doors had not opened. He made himself get up and walk the length of the bus. He checked every row. He checked the small toilet cubicle at the back. He looked under the last few rows. The bus was empty. He filed an incident report at the depot when he returned at 4:30 in the morning. His supervisor was a heavy-set man named Calloway who had managed the overnight operation for 30 years and who had the particular quality of experienced people who have heard everything and given up being surprised by most of it. He read the report carefully. He read it twice, and then he looked at Daxton with an expression that was not dismissive. He said, "Route 11, the coastal highway? Friday nights." Daxton said yes. Calloway put the report in his desk drawer, not the filing cabinet, the desk drawer, which he then locked. He looked at Daxton and said, "Don't drive that route next Friday. Take a different shift." Daxton said, "I need you to tell me why." Calloway was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 12 years ago, a woman was struck and killed on that highway, right at the stop between the Harbor District and the industrial estate. A drunk driver. She died at the scene before the ambulance arrived. The bus driver working Route 11 that night was the first person to reach her. He found her lying in the road in a pale gray dress, her hair spread out around her. Daxton did not speak. Calloway said, "He drove that route for 2 more months. He said she was on the bus every Friday. He said she always sat in the back left seat. He said one night she told him he already knew where she lived." He paused. "That was his last shift. Daxton took a different route the following Friday, and the Friday after that. 3 weeks later, a driver named Zephyr who had been assigned to cover Route 11 came into the depot at 5 in the morning looking pale and quiet in a way that had nothing to do with tiredness. He sat down in the break room with a coffee and did not drink it. He said there had been a woman on the bus. Pale gray dress, dark damp hair, 2:13 in the morning. When he had done his end-of-route walk through, the bus was empty, but the window in the back left seat, the window was fogged on the inside, and in the condensation, very clearly, were the outlines of a hand pressed flat against the glass from inside. 4 fingers and a thumb, pointing back down the road, back toward the stop, back toward the place on the highway where the guardrail was still bent from a crash that had happened 12 years ago, back toward the place she had called home. Story 2. My neighbor watches me sleep. The first night, he thought the old man was waiting for a taxi. It was just past 2 in the morning. Stellan had gotten up for a glass of water, and as he passed the window of his second-floor apartment in a converted terrace building near the university, he looked down at the street below out of nothing more than habit and saw the figure, an elderly man, in a dark coat, standing on the pavement directly across the road from the building, perfectly still, facing Stellan's window. Stellan stood there for a moment, waiting for the man to look at his phone or light a cigarette or shift his weight, but the figure just stood there, hands at his sides, face tilted upward in the direction of Stellan's window. Stellan told himself it was nothing, went back to bed. The following night he was up again at roughly the same hour, and he looked, almost without deciding to, and the man was there again. Same spot, same coat, same complete stillness. On the third night, Stellan set an alarm for 1:30 in the morning and positioned himself at the window before the man usually appeared. At 1:47, a figure in a dark coat walked to the same spot on the pavement below, turned to face the building, and stopped. Stellan watched him for 20 minutes without moving. The man did not move either. The next morning, Stellan knocked on the door of flat 1 on the ground floor, where an elderly resident named Everin had lived alone for as long as anyone in the building could remember. Everin answered in a dressing gown, blinking in the light. He was in his late 70s with white hair and a slight stoop, and he listened to Stellan's description with polite confusion. He said, "I wouldn't know anything about that. I'm in bed by 9 most nights." Stellan thanked him and went back upstairs. He ordered a doorbell camera that afternoon and a second-hand laptop with a basic recording program that he set up pointing at his bedroom window, angled to capture most of the room, on a timer to run from midnight to 4 every morning. 3 nights later he watched the footage. He made a coffee and settled in at his desk and pressed play. The doorbell camera showed the front of the building in crisp wide-angle clarity. At 1:37 in the morning, the front door opened, and a figure in a dark coat stepped out onto the path, walked to the gate, turned left on the pavement, crossed the road, and stood in the usual spot. So far, exactly what Stellan had expected to see. But then he opened the bedroom footage from the same timestamp. The room was dark. Stellan was asleep in his bed, the orange glow of the streetlight visible through the curtains, and standing in the shadows beside the wardrobe was the same elderly man, in the same dark coat, standing inside the bedroom, watching Stellan sleep. Stellan rewound the footage and watched it 3 more times, leaning so close to the screen that his breath fogged it, because what the footage showed was impossible. The man outside on the pavement and the man inside the bedroom were 2 separate individuals. 2 people in identical dark coats with identical builds and identical stillness. One in the street below, one standing in a locked room less than 2 meters from where Stellan slept. He called the police that morning. 2 officers came, watched the footage, checked every window and door of the apartment for forced entry and found nothing. All locks intact. All windows secured from inside. They asked if Stellan knew his neighbors. He said he knew Everin slightly, had spoken to him just days ago. The officers exchanged a look. One of them said, "We've had contact with that address before. A previous tenant reported similar concerns a couple of years ago. They set up a camera as well." The footage showed an elderly male standing beside their bed at night. Stellan said, "So it was Everin." The officer said, "When we spoke to him at the time he had no memory of it. He was assessed and it was attributed to sleepwalking. The previous tenant moved out shortly after." Stellan said, "If Everin was inside my room, then who was standing in the street?" The officer did not answer, because the figure outside and the figure inside were the same build, the same height, the same coat, but they appeared simultaneously, at the same timestamp, in 2 different locations. The sleepwalking explanation could account for one of them. It could not account for both. Stellan moved out 4 days later. He packed quickly and stayed with a friend across the city while he arranged something permanent. On his final visit to collect the last of his things, he passed Everin in the hallway. The old man smiled warmly and said he was sorry to see him go and that the building would be quieter without him. Stellan said goodbye and carried his box to the car. He was putting it in the boot when he looked up at the building. At the second-floor window, his former window, a figure was standing in it. Not Everin, who was still in the hallway downstairs, who Stellan had just spoken to. Someone else, in the dark coat, standing in the empty apartment, looking down at him in the street. As Stellan pulled away from the curb, the figure raised one hand, very slowly, and waved. Story 3. The voice from the baby monitor. It said the same words every single night. The first time Zayden heard it, he was certain it was interference. The baby monitor was 3 months old, a reliable mid-range model, the kind that thousands of parents used without incident, and the idea that it was picking up a stranger's voice from somewhere in the neighborhood was unpleasant but rational. He turned the volume down slightly and went back to sleep, but the words came back. Not distorted, not garbled, clear and low and even, like a man speaking very quietly in a small room, unhurried, almost gentle in tone. "He is not your son anymore." Zayden sat up in bed. The monitor on the nightstand had its green indicator light pulsing steadily, meaning the microphone in the nursery was picking something up. He got out of bed and walked down the hall and pushed open the nursery door. His son Milo, 14 months old, was asleep in his cot, arms out, chest rising and falling slowly. The room was empty. The window was closed and locked. The night light in the corner cast a warm pale glow over the room and everything in it. Daxton stood in the doorway for a long time, watching his son breathe. He went back to bed and told himself it had been a dream. The voice came 4 more times over the following week. Always between 2 and 3 in the morning, always through the monitor, always the same flat unhurried tone and the same 7 words. as though whoever was speaking was not trying to frighten anyone but simply informing them of something that had already happened. On the 5th night, his wife Freya woke up at the same moment the voice came through the speaker and grabbed his arm hard enough to leave marks. They lay rigid in the dark together and the voice said it one more time through the monitor. "He is not your son anymore." They spent the next hour going through every inch of the nursery. Zayden checked under the cot and inside the wardrobe and behind the curtains and even pulled out the chest of drawers from the wall. He checked the crawlspace hatch in the hallway ceiling. He went through the entire upper floor of the house. There was nobody there. In the morning Freya was changing Milo and she called for Zayden with a voice that made him take the stairs 2 at a time. On Milo's left forearm, faint but clear, was a bruise. A cluster of small oval pressure marks arranged in a line with a slight curve. The unmistakable shape of fingertips gripping from underneath. 4 marks in a row. The impression of a hand that was considerably larger than any of Milo's own small hands could possibly produce. They took him to the doctor that day, who examined the bruise and said it was likely from catching his arm between the cot bars in the night. Said it happened with active sleepers sometimes. Freya said Milo had been brought into their bed at 11 and had not been in the cot when the bruise would have needed to form. The doctor made a note and said to come back if anything further occurred. 3 nights later it occurred again. Another bruise, this time on Milo's right calf, same pattern of pressure marks, same size, and the voice had been back through the monitor, but something about it was different this time. It was closer. Not closer in the way that volume changes when you turn a dial, but closer in the way that a sound changes when its source is physically nearer. The quality of the voice had shifted from the thin flat transmission of something coming through a speaker to something that seemed to exist in the actual air of the house, as though whatever was speaking had moved upward. Zayden was awake when it started that night, sitting up with a book. He heard it come through the monitor first, and then the sound seemed to detach itself from the device entirely and he could feel it in the hallway, right outside the bedroom door. "He is not your son anymore." He threw the door open. Empty hallway. Nightlight in the nursery. Silence. He pushed the nursery door open. The cot was empty. His heart stopped completely in that moment, and then he heard a small sound from the corner of the room, behind the rocking chair, and he found Milo there, sitting on the floor in the dark, awake, not crying, hands in his lap, looking up at the far corner of the ceiling. Zayden lifted him and turned on the light and turned to look at what the boy had been staring at. Nothing there. But on the wall just below the ceiling near the window, something had been added since the last time Zayden had looked carefully at that wall. Scratched into the paint, in small uneven letters. Done with something narrow and sharp like a coin or a key. The words, "Give him back." They were out of the house within the week. The new tenants called Freya 3 months later. A young couple who had been told nothing. They said they had been repainting the nursery and when they stripped the old wallpaper they found scratches beneath it. Going down through multiple layers of paint, wall after wall of the same words in different handwriting. "Give him back. Give him back. Give him back." Going back further than any of them had lived in that house. Going back further than anyone could explain. Story 4. The locked hotel room. The sign on the door said simply, "Do not enter." Not out of service. Not under renovation. Not reserved for maintenance. Just 2 words on a laminated card in the door number holder where the number 307 should have been. Kalen had been staying at the Harrogate Motor Inn for 2 nights already by the time that door began to trouble him. He was traveling north along the coast after a conference. And the Harrogate was the kind of place that had been built in the 1960s and then essentially left alone since. Low single-story buildings arranged around a cracked asphalt parking lot. A vending machine near the office that was down to its last 2 choices. A night manager in a flannel shirt who seemed faintly surprised to have a guest at all. Room 307 was at the far end of the building, in a small right-angle extension that looked slightly different from the rest of the structure. Slightly newer, or perhaps just maintained to a marginally higher standard. All the other rooms had windows on the outer wall. 307 did not. Kalen walked past it on the first evening and noticed the absence of a window, and the card on the door, and kept walking. On the second evening he asked the night manager about it. He kept it casual, just conversation while he waited for his key card to be reset. He said, "That room at the end there, 307, is that storage or something?" The manager looked at him for a moment and then looked back at his screen and said, "Storage." Kalen said, "Right." That was the end of it. But that night at around 1 in the morning, lying awake in the thin dark of his room, he heard the sound. A dragging, slow and rhythmic. The sound of something being moved across a hard floor in the room at the end of the building. Then a pause. Then the scratching. A fingernail or something like a fingernail on a hard surface, patient and deliberate, following the same rhythm over and over, as though whatever was making the sound was doing it to be heard. He lay listening for 15 minutes. On the third night it was louder. He lay there in the dark for a while longer than before and then made a decision he had technically made at least an hour before without admitting it to himself. He found a small flathead screwdriver in the bottom of his travel bag. The kind that comes packaged with flat-pack furniture and usually vanishes before it is ever needed. He waited until 2 in the morning, dressed quietly, and walked along the outside of the building in the cold to the end room. He stood at the door of 307 for a moment and listened. Silence. He worked the screwdriver into the door frame. It took about 3 minutes, and then the old tumbler lock shifted and the door swung inward. The smell came first, dry and mineral and faintly sweet. The smell of paper and something underneath it that he did not want to name immediately. He found the light switch. The room was not a storage room. It was a guest room, like any other at the Harrogate. 2 single beds, a small bathroom, a dresser. Heavy curtains pulled shut over a window he had not been able to see from outside because it faced inward toward the service corridor. But the room had been used. Not recently, but extensively, and for a long time. Every surface was covered with objects arranged in rows with the particular care of someone who had spent a great deal of time with them. Suitcases. Dozens of them, vintage hard-sided cases with tarnished metal latches. Old carpet bags. Soft leather holdalls from decades past. All standing open. All emptied. Their contents arranged on the beds and the floor and the dresser in careful groupings. Human teeth, hundreds of them, sorted and arranged with painstaking organization. Molars clustered together. Incisors in their own rows, premolars in neat lines, some still with dark material at the root end, and among them, photographs. Polaroids, printed photos, older black and white prints, face up. Looking at the ceiling, dozens of faces, men and women, some elderly, some very young, some smiling at a camera, some caught unaware, some photographed through glass from a distance in the way that only a person who did not want to be seen would photograph another person. On the back of each photograph, a date, a location, a name. Kalen left the room and went directly to the office and knocked until the manager opened the door. He said he had heard something from 307 and wanted to report it. The manager's face did not change in the way that an innocent person's face changes when they hear unexpected news. He looked at Kalen for a long moment and said, "I told you that was storage." Kalen got into his car and drove for 4 hours without stopping. He called emergency services from a petrol station and gave the address of the motel and described what he had found. Officers arrived at the Harrogate that morning and confirmed the contents of room 307. They identified 38 names from the photographs. 29 of those names appeared in missing persons records from across a radius of nearly 300 miles, spanning 4 decades. The night manager was gone by the time they returned to question him. His flannel shirt was still on the back of his office chair. His car was still in the lot. He was never found, but the suitcases were traced. Each one came from a different transport hub, a different train station or bus terminal or airport across 4 separate countries. Each one representing a journey that someone had begun, and had not completed. Story 5. Someone lives in my attic. The first note was under her pillow. Novalai was 9 years old when she found it. She was pulling her pillow to the edge of the bed the way she always did before getting up, and the folded square of paper fell out from underneath and landed on the duvet in front of her. She unfolded it. It was written in pencil, in small careful letters that someone had taken time over, and it said, "I can hear you breathing." She carried it downstairs and gave it to her parents at the breakfast table. Her father Malachi looked at it, looked at his wife Azalea, said it was probably from one of Novalai's friends at school. Novalai said she had not shown anyone at school. Malachi searched the house that evening. He was thorough about it: cupboards, under the beds, the garage, the garden shed. He had moved his family into this house in a quiet suburban street near the hills 4 months ago and had done a full inspection before signing the lease, and everything had been in order. He had not checked the attic. There was a hatch in the hallway ceiling, a plain square panel with a recessed handle. He got the stepladder from the garage and climbed up far enough to look around. The attic was full of the previous family's belongings. Boxes and dust-sheeted furniture stacked in the way that people leave things when they move in a hurry. The floor was fully boarded. There was plenty of room to stand and move around up there. Malachi checked for about 15 minutes, moving boxes, lifting sheet corners, looking for anything recently disturbed. He found nothing out of the ordinary. He bought 2 small bolts from the hardware store the next morning and secured the hatch from below. The footsteps started a week later. At night, after everyone was in bed, the slow, careful sound of someone moving across the floor above the ceiling of the master bedroom, back and forth, stopping for long intervals, then moving again, patient and unhurried. Malachi and Azalea lay listening to them for 3 nights. Rats, settling timbers, the wind in the roof cavity, any explanation was better than the one they were not yet saying aloud. On the 4th night, Malachi called an exterminator. The man came in the morning and spent an hour in the attic and came back down with a slightly puzzled expression. He said there was no evidence of any animal activity at all, no droppings, no gnaw marks, no nesting material anywhere in the space. He also said, with a slight frown, that he seemed to be trying to keep casual, that the bolts on the hatch had been opened from the inside. Malachi said, "The bolts were on my side, on the outside of the hatch." The exterminator said, "I know." That evening they found the second note, not under Novali's pillow this time, tucked between the pages of the book that Azalea had been reading in bed, inserted at the exact page she had stopped at the night before, as though whoever had placed it there had known exactly where to put it. The same small, careful pencil letters. "I can hear you breathing." Malachi called the police that night. 2 officers came and searched the attic. They found the same evidence of previous occupancy that the exterminator had not found, because what the exterminator had not known to look for was tucked in the far corner behind a large wooden wardrobe that had been pushed against the sloping wall. Behind the wardrobe was a space that had been cleared and cleaned. A folded blanket against the wall, a battery-powered torch, a small tin containing crackers and a wrapped cereal bar. And in the corner nearest the eaves, a hole had been carefully cut in the thin plasterboard, a clean circular opening just large enough to look through, into Novali's bedroom. The police found fingerprints on the torch and the tin. They matched a man who had been reported missing by his own family 8 months earlier. A man who had grown up in this house, inherited it from his parents, and lost it to debt when he could no longer keep up the mortgage payments. He was found 2 days later in a park a few miles away, sitting on a bench in a thin jacket in the cold. He did not resist when the officers approached. He sat with his hands on his knees and looked up at them with an expression that was not defiant or frightened but simply depleted, like a man who had been holding something together for a very long time and had finally run out of strength. When they asked him about the notes, he said only, "I just wanted her to know I was there." Novali slept with the light on for 2 years after that, and sometimes even now she wakes up before dawn, and lies very still, and listens to the silence above the ceiling, and breathes as quietly as she possibly can. Story 6. The Raincoat Man. He was always there before the rain. That was the thing the children in the town of Ashwick noticed first. Not the coat. Though the coat was strange, a heavy yellow raincoat that was slightly too large for the figure wearing it, with the hood pulled up against a wind that was not blowing. Not the height, though he was tall in a way that made people look twice. The kind of tall that seemed to exceed what the human body ought reasonably to be. Was the timing? He would appear somewhere on the edge of the town, at a corner or a field boundary or at the end of a residential street, standing completely still, and then without fail, 20 minutes later, the clouds would thicken and the rain would come. The children had started calling him the Weather Man, until the night that Brielle's little brother Jetson opened the front door. Ashwick was a small market town in the hill country of rural Victoria. The kind of town where families had lived for 4 or 5 generations and where people still left their back doors unlocked during the day. It sat in a fold between 2 wooded hills about 60 miles from the nearest city and had the particular quality of old places where the past and the present overlap in ways you cannot always see clearly. The first disappearance was in early autumn. A boy named Fletcher, 12 years old, who lived near the old mill on the edge of town. He had been watching television during a storm and had apparently gone to the kitchen for a drink and not returned. His parents found the back door open and rain coming in across the tiles and no sign of Fletcher anywhere in the house or garden. Police searched for 4 days. They found nothing. His parents mentioned to the investigating officer that the day before the storm, a neighbor had seen a man in a yellow raincoat standing at the end of their road. The second disappearance was 3 weeks later. A girl named Orinda, 10 years old, again during a storm, again a door found open, again nothing to find. And the previous day, someone had seen the tall yellow figure at the top of her street. By the third disappearance, the town meeting in the community hall was standing room only. Police were present. They said they were treating the reports of the figure seriously. They asked that parents keep children away from doors and windows during storms and report any sightings immediately. That was the night Jetson made his mistake. He was 8 years old and he had been left in the care of his 16-year-old sister Brielle while their parents attended the meeting. He had gone upstairs to his room. Brielle was in the sitting room. The storm had started about an hour earlier and the front door had a loose catch that sometimes let go in high winds. She heard the latch click. She got up thinking it was the wind. But Jetson was standing in the open doorway. He was wearing his coat and his shoes. The shoes on the wrong feet the way he did when he dressed quickly. He was standing in the open door in the rain, looking out into the street, not moving. Brielle grabbed him and pulled him back inside and said, "What are you doing?" He said, in a flat, absent voice that did not sound quite like his own. The man outside said to come. Brielle said, "What man?" He pointed at the door. She looked through the peephole. At the end of the path, just past the gate, at the edge of the streetlight's reach, stood a very tall figure in a yellow raincoat, perfectly still, the hood up, the coat hanging slightly wrong on the frame beneath it. Brielle pulled Jetson away from the door and called their father. Her father Malachi was back in 6 minutes. He went into the street immediately with a torch and searched the area for 20 minutes in the rain. The figure was gone. But Jetson would not wake up the next morning. He was breathing, warm, uninjured, but completely unreachable, like a person in very deep sleep except that nothing could rouse him. He was taken to hospital where doctors ran every available test. No toxins, no trauma, no neurological abnormality, normal brain activity on every scan. He simply would not wake. He has been in that state for 8 months now. And in Ashwick, when the clouds gather and the rain begins to smell on the air before it falls, parents go to every window and every door, and look out at the street, just in case. Story 7. I found a phone in the woods. The battery was at 3% when Stellan found it. He almost missed it entirely. It was lying face down on a patch of moss about 20 feet off the trail, partially covered by a large fallen leaf. The back cracked diagonally from corner to corner like something had landed on it from above rather than dropped it from hip height. He only noticed it because the moss around it was flattened in the particular way that moss flattens when something falls onto it rather than rests on it gradually. Stellan was 17 and hiking the Clearwater Trail alone on an autumn afternoon while his parents waited at the car park at the trailhead. It was a 2-hour loop through dense pine forest about 40 miles outside the city. Popular in summer but almost empty by late October. He had not seen another hiker in over an hour. He picked the phone up. 3% battery. No passcode. The wallpaper was a photo of 2 smiling people in their 30s standing outside a large wooden house. He opened the gallery to try to identify whose phone it was. The most recent video was dated 6 days ago. He pressed play. The footage was shaky, poor light. The camera swinging through dark shapes of trees before stabilizing as whoever was holding it pressed their back against something solid. A man's voice, mid-30s, breathing hard and clearly frightened, whispered directly into the camera, "It's been following me for 2 hours. I can't get away. I keep trying to find the trail and every direction I go I end up further in." The camera tilted slowly to show the dark spaces between the trees. "I can hear it moving," the voice said. "The sounds aren't right. It doesn't move the way an animal moves." A long pause, only breathing, then very quietly. "It knows I filmed it." The video ended. Stellan stood in the middle of the trail holding the cracked phone with 3% battery left and looked at the dark screen for a long moment. He scrolled back through the gallery. 11 videos, all filmed over a 3-day period, all in the same forest, all the same voice. The early videos were frustrated and confused but calm. The man was lost and irritated and describing trail markers and his GPS not working in which direction he had tried to walk. He mentioned his wife, said she would be worried. By the 4th video he was moving fast and looking behind him. The 6th video he said quietly, "There's something wrong with the trees." The 7th, "It watches from behind them." The 8th, filmed mostly pointing at the sky, 40 seconds long, just the voice saying, "It's not an animal. If anyone finds this, please don't come looking for me, just don't." Stellan's phone had 2 bars of signal. He called his father and said, "Dad, call search and rescue." He gave the GPS coordinates from the cracked phone's final active location. He described the path and the trail marker he was standing beside. Search and rescue went in the following morning with 2 dogs and 6 people. They found the man's tent, pitched and then abandoned, his sleeping bag dragged out and left on the forest floor, his pack untouched with everything still inside it. They did not find the man. They searched for 4 days. One of the team, a man with 20 years of experience in backcountry search operations, told a journalist some months afterward that in all his time doing this work he had never seen a search scene quite like it. He said the ground around the abandoned camp was disturbed in ways he could not account for. The marks in the soil were not consistent with footprints of any kind, not human, not animal. He said they were wider and deeper than any footprint he had seen. And they moved through the forest undergrowth without disturbing a single branch or leaf, as though whatever made them was very careful about not being heard. Story 8. The Basement Rules. The list was typed on a single sheet of paper, laminated, and taped to the inside of the security booth door. Rules for night security personnel. Meriton General Hospital, Legacy Wing. 1. Do not use the service elevator after 11 p.m. 2. Do not enter rooms on level 2 that have a green tape marker on the door handle. 3. Do not respond to alarms in the east corridor between 2 and 3 a.m. Known fault. Maintenance has been notified. 4. If you hear sounds from basement level 3, do not investigate. Do not descend the level 3 stairwell. Do not open the level 3 stairwell door. Log the time and note in your written report at the end of the shift. Everin read the list twice, made himself a coffee from the flask he had brought from home, and began his first walkthrough of the Legacy Wing at 11 p.m. on the dot. He had been working night security for 14 years. Shopping centers, office parks, a stadium, a ferry terminal. He was 56 years old and not given to anxiety, and he took the laminated list as the kind of institutional caution that old buildings with old wiring and old plumbing generated naturally. Every decommissioned building had its quirks, its creaks, its unreliable systems. He had seen all of it before. The Legacy Wing was the Victorian-era original hospital building, red brick and high ceilings and those long tiled corridors that never fully lost the smell of antiseptic no matter how many decades had passed since the last patient. The new hospital was a modern structure on the other side of the car park. This building was waiting for planning approval to become something else. In the meantime, it held decades of archived medical records in its basements and a contract with a security firm to keep people from wandering in. Basement level 3 had not been in active use for 30 years. He knew this because he had asked during his handover briefing, and the day manager had told him in the particular tone that people use when they want to pass on information without drawing attention to the fact that they are passing it on. The first 4 nights were uneventful. On the 5th night, at 2:19 in the morning, during his walkthrough of the ground floor, he heard it. The sound reached him from somewhere below, through the floor, through the walls. He stopped walking and stood still and listened, crying. But wrong in some way he was trying to identify. The rhythm of it was too regular. The intervals between the sounds were too even. Real crying has a shape to it. It rises and breaks and catches and subsides. This had none of that organic variability. This had the quality of repetition, of something that had been doing this for a long time and had forgotten the reason but continued anyway. He stood at the top of the stairwell door and listened for 3 minutes. He remembered the 4th rule. He wrote the time in his log. He went back to his booth. The following night the sound was closer to the stairwell door. The night after that, Everin was in the ground floor corridor at 2:14 in the morning when the crying started, and this time it was different. This time the voice was his mother's. He stopped so suddenly that he put a hand out to the wall to steady himself. He stood in the corridor in the dark with the hairs on the back of his neck flat against his skin and listened to the voice of the woman he had last heard 3 years ago, in a hospital ward 2 cities away, in the final weeks of her illness. Said his name, in her voice, from below the floor. He walked to the level 3 stairwell door and put his hand on the handle and stood there. He thought about the list. He thought about why a rule gets written down and laminated and taped inside a door. He had worked 14 years in night security in a dozen different buildings, and he had never been handed a laminated list of rules that included do not respond to crying from a specific location. You do not write a rule for something that will not happen. He stood at the door for a very long time. He let go of the handle. He went back to his booth and sat and did not move until 6 in the morning when the day manager arrived. He filed the written report as required. Sounds heard from basement level 3, 2:14 a.m. Ongoing for approximately 7 minutes. He handed in his notice at the same time he handed in the report. His supervisor said he had been their best night worker on the Legacy Wing. Said they had struggled to keep people on that shift. Said if it was about the money there were options. Everin said it was not about the money. He said, "What's in basement level 3? His supervisor said, "Medical records." Everin said, "Then why the rule?" His supervisor said, "Damp causes sounds in old structures. The staff find it distressing." Everin said, "It used my mother's voice." His supervisor was quiet for a moment. He looked at his desk. He looked back at Everin. And then he said, very quietly, "They always do." Everin left without asking what that meant. He thinks about it still. Some nights he wakes up in the early hours and lies in the quiet and thinks about what it must know. To reach into a person and find the one voice that will make them open a door. And he thinks about all the night security workers who came before him, and wonders how many of them let go of the handle, and how many of them did not. Story 9. The face in the window. There were no footprints in the snow. That was the detail she came back to, long after the police had gone and the roads had been plowed and the temperature had climbed and the snow had shrunk back to gray patches on the shadow side of the garden wall. Long after she had tried every version of a rational explanation and found them all wanting. The face she could almost explain away. She had been alone for several days and was exhausted, and the snowstorm had been disorienting in the way that heavy snowfall at night always is. The way it muffles the world and makes the light come from the wrong direction and fills the air with a silence that feels active rather than neutral. She could explain away the light playing on the glass. But there were no footprints. Isolde was staying alone in a rented cottage on the edge of a small village in the southern Alps of New Zealand. A converted farmhouse on a narrow road with views of the mountains on clear days and a wood burner that kept the low rooms warm even when the temperature outside dropped hard. Her partner was away for work and she had planned to spend the week reading and walking and not looking at her phone. On the third night of the storm, she was reading in the sitting room by the fire at around 11 p.m. when something made her look up at the window. She could not explain the something. It was not a sound or a movement. It was a shift in the quality of the air in the room. The particular prickle of awareness that something in the environment had changed. She looked up. At the window. The sitting room window that faced the front garden and the stone wall at the property edge. There was a face. Pale. Very pale. Pressed close to the glass from outside, framed by the dark and the falling snow. It was looking directly at her. It was entirely still. She screamed and scrambled backward off the sofa and knocked the floor lamp over and stood in the sudden dark of the room with her phone already in her hand and her heart in her throat. She turned on every light in the cottage, called emergency services, and stood in the middle of the sitting room with the fireplace poker in one hand until she heard the car outside 12 minutes later. 2 officers came in and she told them what she had seen and pointed at the window. They searched the garden with torches. They checked the full perimeter of the property. They looked at the walls and the gate and the footpath. When they came back inside, one of the officers, a woman in her 40s with a steady and methodical manner, sat down and said, "Ms. Isolde, can you describe exactly where on the window the face appeared to be?" Isolde said, "At the glass, pressed against it from outside." The officer said, "The window sill on the outside is approximately 4 meters from the garden ground level. The terrain drops away steeply from the front of the cottage toward the road. There is no external ledge, no trellis or climbing frame against the wall, no ladder anywhere on the property." Isolde said, "I know what I saw." The officer said, "I believe you. What I'm telling you is that the window is above the second floor equivalent given the slope, and there is no visible means by which anyone could have been standing at it." Isolde looked at the window. She said, "And the footprints?" The officer said, "The snow has been undisturbed around the full perimeter of the property since it stopped falling at around 8 p.m. It is now 11:50. In this depth of snow, anyone outside this building would have left clear impressions. There were no impressions. The officers said they would increase patrols on the road overnight. They said if she was uncomfortable being alone, she could stay at the village hotel. She said she would be fine. She was embarrassed now and cold and wanted them to leave so she could think. They left. She sat with every light on and the poker still in her hand until 4 in the morning and then fell asleep on the sofa without meaning to. In the morning she made tea and looked out at the garden in the weak winter light, and noticed something in the snow that she had not seen in the dark. At the base of the stone wall at the front edge of the property, where the snow was deepest, there were marks. Not footprints. Long shallow parallel channels in the surface of the snow, evenly spaced, leading from the direction of the road to the base of the cottage wall directly below the window, and back again. The kind of marks that would be left by something moving close to the ground. Something heavy enough to compress the snow but not making contact with it in the shape of a foot. Something that did not walk. The marks stopped directly below the window where she had seen the face. She photographed everything and sent the images to the officer who had attended the night before. 3 weeks later she received a brief email. It said no explanation had been found for the marks or the reported sighting. It said the case would remain open but that no active investigation was continuing. The last line said, "We would advise against staying in remote properties alone during the winter months." Isolde has lived in city apartments ever since. But in winter, when snow settles on her window ledge overnight, she wakes before dawn, and she does not look at the glass. Not for a long time. Story 10. The Hitchhiker on Route 66. He saw him the first time just outside Barstow. Calloway had been long-haul driving for 19 years. He had put close to 3 million miles on various vehicles across North America and Europe, and he was not a man who unsettled easily. He was practical and measured and proud of it. So when he first saw the man on the shoulder of the road, he processed him as ordinary. A hitchhiker standing roadside with his thumb out was as old as highways themselves. The man was wearing dark jeans and a pale shirt, no bag, no backpack, which was slightly unusual for someone traveling on foot but not remarkable. Calloway had a policy about hitchhikers, not a moral one, simply a practical one that experience had shaped. He drove past and did not think about it, until 40 minutes later. He was east of Amboy, the road straight and the night flat and dark in both directions. When he saw the man again, same jeans, same pale shirt, same position on the right shoulder, thumb out, Calloway slowed without meaning to. He looked at the man as the truck went past. The man looked back. The face was ordinary, middle-aged, plain features that offered nothing remarkable, except the eyes, which were very light, almost the color of old glass, and which tracked the truck with an attention that was too precise for a man hoping for a lift, too focused, too patient. Calloway drove on. He told himself the man had caught a faster ride and been dropped off further up the road. It was possible, barely possible, but it was the rational thing to tell himself. He saw him again outside Needles. Same jeans, same shirt, same stillness, same pale eyes moving to follow the truck. Calloway pulled over a mile past that stop, not to go back, just to sit with the engine running and think. He looked in his side mirror at the dark road behind him. He kept driving. He saw the man 3 more times before the Arizona border, once near the river crossing, once at a junction that Calloway had driven past without incident dozens of times but at which he had never seen a single person standing, and once in the car park of a truck stop where Calloway had deliberately stopped specifically to be around other vehicles and other people and to drink a bad coffee and feel normal. That time, when he came back out of the diner, the man was standing at the edge of the car park, at the boundary where the fluorescent lights ended and the dark of the lot began, not looking at the diner, not looking at the other trucks parked around him, looking at Calloway's cab. Calloway went back inside and sat for another 25 minutes. When he came out again, the man was gone. He crossed the car park, climbed up into the cab, sat for a moment with his hand on the ignition. The passenger door opened. The man climbed in. Calloway did not move. He sat with both hands on the wheel and looked at the man now sitting in the seat beside him in the dark of the cab. Up close, the man looked entirely real and entirely physical. His shirt had creases and texture. His hands rested on his knees with the roughness of someone who worked with them. He smelled of dry desert air and dust. There was nothing theatrical or dramatic about his presence. Nothing that announced itself as supernatural or impossible. Only the eyes, and the fact that Calloway had last seen him standing in a car park 40 miles behind him 10 minutes ago. The man looked at him and said, in a completely ordinary voice, "You drive this road every week?" Calloway said, "Yes." The man said, "I've been watching you for a long time." Calloway said nothing. The man said, "You are a careful driver? You have always been careful. But it won't be enough this time." Calloway said, "What won't be enough?" The man said, "The truck that crosses the center line will be moving very fast. You won't have time to react." He paused. October 14th, 3:17 in the morning. The interstate between Flagstaff and Albuquerque. He said it the way a person reads from a schedule, flat and even and without drama. The way someone gives information they did not generate and take no pleasure in conveying. Calloway looked at him. The man looked back. Then the man said, "I'm sorry." He said, "You should call your daughter." Calloway looked away, at the windscreen, at the dark car park, at the orange running lights of the other trucks around him. He held himself very still. He looked back at the passenger seat. Empty. The door was closed, exactly as he had left it before going into the diner. The seatbelt was in its holder, untouched. The seat showed no impression and no warmth. Calloway sat in the car park until his hands stopped shaking, which took a while. He called his daughter from the car park that night. She answered on the third ring, sounding surprised and slightly worried at the late hour. He told her he loved her and that he was thinking of her. She said she loved him too and asked if he was all right. He said he was fine, just thinking. He drove the rest of the route without incident. He drove the route the following week, and the week after. He did not see the man again. The shoulder of the highway between Barstow and the Arizona border was empty every night. On the 12th of October, Calloway woke at 1 in the morning and lay in the dark for a long time. He was not exactly afraid. He was something quieter and more settled than fear, something that felt like a decision that had already been made. He called his dispatcher at 2 a.m. and said he had a migraine and could not drive the route that night. The dispatcher was irritated and had to scramble for a replacement. Calloway did not apologize. At 3:23 in the morning, on the interstate between Flagstaff and Albuquerque, a freight truck traveling in the opposite direction lost its rear left tire. The vehicle crossed the center line. The replacement driver, a man named Zephyr who had been on the road for 6 hours and was alert and experienced and had done nothing wrong, had exactly no time to react. Zephyr survived. Badly injured, 3 months of recovery, but alive. Calloway drives the route still, every week. He has not seen the pale-eyed man on the shoulder since that night in the car park. He has not seen him in the cab or in any diner or at any junction. But every night when he climbs up into the cab before setting out, he checks the passenger seat. Before putting the key in the ignition, he checks the passenger seat, because if the man is ever there again, he wants to know what he has to say. Story 11. My dead friend keeps messaging me. The first text came at 2:47 in the morning. Caspian was half asleep, his phone face down on the nightstand, when the screen lit up the entire ceiling of his bedroom in a pale blue glow. He groaned, reached for it without opening his eyes, and squinted at the notification. It was from Ronan. He sat up so fast his head spun. Ronan had been dead for 11 days. Caspian stared at the screen. His hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped the phone. The message was simple. Just 4 words sitting there in a little gray bubble like nothing in the world was wrong. Did you lock up? He told himself it was a mistake. Someone had gotten Ronan's number reassigned. That happened, right? Phone companies recycled numbers. It was a coincidence. A terrible, gut-punching coincidence that made his chest feel like someone had reached inside and squeezed his heart with both hands. He did not respond. He put the phone back down, face down this time, and lay there in the dark staring at the ceiling until the alarm went off at 6. Let me tell you about Ronan first, because you need to understand who he was before you can understand why what happened next was so deeply, irreversibly wrong. Ronan had been Caspian's best friend since they were 7 years old. They had grown up 2 houses apart on a quiet street in Portland, Oregon, the kind of street where everyone knew everyone and the summer smelled like pine and rain and fresh-cut grass. Ronan was the kind of person who made every room feel warmer just by walking into it. He laughed too loud, ate too fast, and had a habit of finishing other people's sentences in the most unexpectedly accurate way. He was the first person Caspian called when something good happened and the first person he wanted to see when something went wrong. He had drowned on a Saturday afternoon. They had been at Caspian's family's lake house in the mountains outside the city. It was a beautiful day. The kind of day that makes you forget anything bad could ever happen in the world. Clear sky, warm water, the sound of a radio playing from someone's dock further up the shore. Ronan had gone out for a swim while Caspian was inside making lunch. That was the last time Caspian saw him alive. By the time he came back out with 2 sandwiches and 2 sodas, the water was calm and Ronan was gone. They found his body the next morning. The official ruling was accidental drowning. No signs of foul play. No explanation for how it happened because Ronan was an excellent swimmer, had been swimming in that lake his entire life, knew every current and every shallow rock. But accidents happened. That was what everyone said. Accidents happened and there was no sense to be made of them, and you just had to keep breathing and put one foot in front of the other and trust that eventually the weight of it would get lighter. Caspian was not doing well at trusting that. He had barely left his apartment since the funeral. He worked from home, answered emails on autopilot, ate food without tasting it, and slept in broken pieces. The grief was a physical thing. It sat on his chest when he woke up and followed him into every room. And then on the 11th night, Ronan's number texted him. Did you lock up? It was an odd thing to say. Caspian turned it over in his mind all the next day between phone calls and coffee cups and the sound of traffic outside his window. Did you lock up? It was such a specific question. Not hello or thinking of you or I miss you. Lock up what? Lock up where? The second text came 3 nights later. Same time. 2:47 in the morning exactly. This time it said, the key is still under the rock. Caspian went cold all over. The key under the rock. There was a spare key to the lake house. It had always been kept under a flat gray rock to the left of the back door, half hidden by a clump of weeds. It had been there since before Caspian was born. His parents had put it there. Almost no one knew about it. His family. And Ronan. Ronan, who had been to that lake house hundreds of times. Ronan, who had used that key once when they were teenagers and had locked themselves out after a night swim and did not want to wake Caspian's parents. Caspian sat on the edge of his bed and read that message 8 times. Then he called the phone company. They told him Ronan's number had not been reassigned. It was still registered to Ronan's account. It would remain on hold for several months as per standard procedure, before being released back into circulation, which meant the texts were coming from Ronan's actual phone. He called Ronan's parents. He felt sick doing it, calling them, hearing the hollow, careful way Ronan's mother answered the phone like she was bracing herself every time for more bad news. He asked about the phone as gently as he could. He told them he had received some texts and he thought maybe someone had access to it. Ronan's mother was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "His phone was recovered with his body. We have it in a drawer. We haven't been able to bring ourselves to turn it off." "Is it in the house right now?" Caspian asked. "Yes," she said. "It's in his room." "Why?" He did not know how to answer that. He thanked her and hung up and sat in his dark apartment and tried to think logically about what was happening. Someone had access to the phone. Someone had broken into the Vala's home, taken Ronan's phone, sent the texts and returned it. That was the only explanation that made any sense. But who would do something like that? And why? The third text came exactly 3 nights later. 2:47 again. Like clockwork. This one said, "You didn't go back. You were supposed to go back." Caspian's blood went cold. He had been thinking about going back to the lake house. He had been thinking about it obsessively, actually, in the way your mind returns to a wound it cannot leave alone. He had told no one. He had not written it down. It had been a private, half-formed thought he kept circling in the dark hours of the night. And Ronan's phone knew about it. He typed back. His fingers were shaking but he typed back. "Ronan." 3 dots appeared immediately. Like whoever was on the other end had been waiting. The response came. "Something is wrong with where I am. It is not right here. You need to come to the lake. You need to come now. Bring the key." Caspian did not sleep that night. He called his older brother Dorian the next morning and told him everything. He expected Dorian to tell him he was grieving and losing his mind, that the brain does strange things when it is in pain, that there was a rational explanation for all of it. Dorian was a practical man. A structural engineer. He believed in things he could measure and test and hold in his hands. Instead, Dorian was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "I'm coming over." Dorian arrived within the hour. He sat at Caspian's kitchen table and read through every message, his expression getting darker with each one. "The key under the rock," he said. "Who knew about that?" "Nobody," Caspian said. "Just family. And Ronan. And the thing about going back to the lake house. You hadn't told anyone?" "No one." Dorian set the phone down on the table. He pressed his fingers to his mouth and stared at the wall. "We need to go to the lake house," he said finally. "Dorian?" "Not because we think Ronan is texting us from the dead," Dorian said firmly in his measured engineer's voice. "But because someone is. Someone who knew things they should not know. And I want to know who it is and how they know it." They drove up to the lake house the following Saturday. The same day of the week that Ronan had died. Caspian had not been back since. Walking up the gravel path toward the house felt like pressing on a bruise. Everything looked exactly the same. The wooden dock stretching out over the gray-green water. The red canoe upturned on the shore. The wind moving through the tall pines on either side of the yard. He went directly to the back of the house and crouched down beside the door. He moved the flat gray rock. The key was there. He had not doubted it would be. He did not know why he had not doubted it. He picked it up and held it in his palm and felt the weight of it, cold and small and real. They went inside. Everything looked undisturbed. Dust on the surfaces, chairs pushed in, the faint smell of pine and something underneath it, something faintly damp and dark, the smell of the lake coming in through the walls. They searched the entire house. Nothing. No one hiding in the closets. No one in the basement. No signs of a break-in. No signs of anything unusual at all, except for one thing. In the bedroom Ronan always used when he stayed there, the window was open. Just slightly. Just enough for the curtain to move in the breeze. Caspian had closed every window in the house the last time he left. He remembered doing it. He had stood in every room and pulled down every window and locked the latches. He was meticulous about it. It was the last thing he did before he left that day, before he came back outside and found the water smooth and empty and Ronan gone. He stood in the doorway of Ronan's room and stared at that window. Dorian came up behind him and was quiet. Then Caspian's phone buzzed. 2:47 in the afternoon. Not the middle of the night. The middle of the day. He looked at the screen. It was Ronan's number. The message said, "You came. Now look under the mattress." Neither of them moved for a very long moment. Then Dorian crossed the room, gripped the edge of the mattress and lifted it. Underneath was a phone. Not Ronan's phone. A different phone. A cheap prepaid model, the kind you bought at a gas station with cash, no registration required. The screen was lit. The messaging app was open. And there was a camera. A small wireless camera, no bigger than a button, attached to the underside of the box spring and pointed directly at the doorway. Someone had been watching. Someone had set up a camera in this room. Someone had been monitoring this house, watching who came and went, and using a prepaid phone to send messages from a spoofed number that appeared to be Ronan's. Dorian called the police. While they waited, Caspian sat outside on the dock and stared at the water and tried to understand who hated him enough to do this. Who would do this? Who would take Ronan's death and use it as a tool to manipulate and terrify a grieving person? The police pulled recordings off the camera. They found footage going back 3 weeks. The camera had been placed there before Ronan died, which meant whoever had done this had planned it, had known or intended for Ronan not to come back from that swim. The investigation took 4 months. The person they arrested was a man named Alaric, a former business partner of Caspian's father who had been involved in a legal dispute with the family for years. He had believed Caspian's family had wronged him. He had decided that the most devastating way to hurt them was not financial. It was personal. He had found out about the lake house, about the spare key, about all the small private details of their lives through years of quiet, obsessive surveillance. Ronan's death had not been an accident. Alaric had been at the lake that day. He had slipped into the water from the far side of the cove, hidden by the tree line, while Caspian was inside making lunch. The investigation could not prove exactly what happened in the water. But it no longer looked like an accident. It no longer felt like one either. Caspian gave his testimony at the trial on a gray November morning. He sat in the witness box and answered questions in a steady voice and did not look at Alaric. After it was over, he went back to the lake house one last time. He stood at the end of the dock as the sun went down and turned the water the color of old copper. He took out his phone. He went to the thread of messages that had come from Ronan's number, the messages that were not from Ronan, the messages that had been designed to destroy him. And he deleted them. Then he sat with the real Ronan, the one that lived now only in his memory, and he said goodbye properly. The water was very still. Somewhere in the pines, a bird called once and then went silent. Story 12. The camping trip recording. The 4 of them had been friends since university. Kieran was the one who planned it. He was always the one who planned things, the type of person who made spreadsheets for road trips and printed out backup maps even when everyone else trusted GPS. He had found the campsite through an outdoor hiking forum, a spot deep in the fjordland wilderness of New Zealand's South Island, 4 hours from the nearest town, accessible only by a narrow trail that threaded through old-growth beech forest so thick the canopy blocked out the sky. No signal, Kieran told them cheerfully as they loaded up their packs in the car park at the end of the road. No Wi-Fi. No nothing. Just us and the forest for 5 days. Maddox groaned theatrically. Bodhi grinned. Aveline adjusted her pack straps and looked out at the dark gap in the tree line where the trail began and felt, just for a moment, the smallest flicker of something she could not name. Not quite unease. Not quite dread. Something quieter than both. Like a held breath. She shook it off and followed the others into the trees. The first 2 days were perfect. They hiked through forest that felt ancient and alive, ferns the size of small trees pushing up through the undergrowth, the trail weaving along the edge of a river that ran cold and clear over smooth gray stones. They saw no other people. At night the sky above their clearing was solid with stars, the Milky Way visible in a way that Aveline had only ever seen in photographs, and they sat around the fire and talked the way you can only talk when you are very far from everything and the darkness outside the firelight feels enormous and complete. Bodhi had brought a camera. A good one, a mirrorless model he used for landscape photography, and he had set up a series of time-lapse sequences overnight, the camera mounted on a small tripod outside the tent, pointed up at the sky to capture the star movement. On the 3rd morning he downloaded the footage to his laptop while the others made coffee. He went very quiet. "Hey," Kieran said. "You okay?" Bodhi looked up from the screen. His face was an expression Aveline had never seen on him before. He was a calm person. Unflappable. She had once watched him navigate a car off a cliff edge on a mountain road in Iceland with no more visible emotion than mild concentration. He looked shaken now. "Come look at this," he said. They gathered around the laptop screen. The footage was time-lapse at first. The sky wheeling slowly overhead, stars arcing in perfect curves, the tree line at the edge of the clearing dark and still. The fire had burned down to coals and then to gray ash as the hours passed. And then, at the bottom right corner of the timestamp, when the clock read 3:04 a.m., they were all standing outside the tent. All four of them. Standing in a loose ring around the tent, facing outward, utterly motionless. Their arms at their sides. Their heads slightly raised, facing the tree line. Eveline made a sound she had never made before. A kind of involuntary exhale like someone had pressed on her chest. Because she had no memory of this. None of them did. She remembered going to sleep. She remembered the warmth of the sleeping bag, the sound of the river, Kieran's quiet breathing in the tent beside her. She remembered nothing after that until she woke in the gray pre-dawn light still inside the tent. "How long are we standing there?" Maddox asked. His voice was very careful. The voice of someone trying to be the reasonable one while every instinct they had screamed. 43 minutes, Bodhi said. They watched the whole sequence in silence. 43 minutes of standing completely motionless in the dark. 43 minutes of faces turned toward the trees. Not speaking. Not moving. Barely, it seemed, breathing. And then at 3:47 a.m. they all turned at exactly the same time and went back inside the tent. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was what was in the trees. You had to look closely. The time-lapse compression made it hard to see at first. But if you paused the footage and looked at the tree line, at the thick dark mass of beech forest just beyond the clearing's edge, something was moving. Something large. Large enough that you could see the undergrowth shifting, the lower branches of the trees swaying, in a pattern that did not match the wind. A slow, methodical circling. Around the clearing. Around the four of them standing there in the dark. Whatever it was never came into the open. It stayed at the edge of vision, in the space between shadow and solid, moving with a kind of unhurried patience that felt worse than any speed would have. "We need to pack up," Kieran said. No one argued. They were on the trail within the hour, moving at a pace that was just barely not running, their packs bouncing, nobody talking. The forest felt different now. The same trees, the same trail, the same sound of the river running alongside them. But the quality of the silence had changed. It felt occupied. It felt watched. They were 2 hours from the trailhead when Maddox stopped. He turned around and looked back down the trail behind them. "Where's Ronan?" he said. They all stopped. They all looked at each other. Kieran, Bodhi, Eveline, Maddox, four of them. But they had started as five. Ronan had been there. He had been there when they planned the trip, when they packed the cars, when they hiked in. He had set up his tent next to Bodhi's. He had been there at the fire on the second night, had laughed at something Maddox said, had been the last one to go inside. They could not remember him on the third day. They could not remember him at all on the morning they watched the camera footage. They had not thought of him. Had not noticed his absence. Had eaten breakfast and packed bags and started hiking, and not once had any of them registered that the fifth person in their group was not there. Aveline's voice, when she spoke, came out barely above a whisper. "He was in the tent," she said. "He was sleeping next to me." She stopped. She looked down at her hands. I think he was next to me." They went back. Of course they went back. They found their campsite undisturbed. 4 sleeping bags. 4 packs. The cold remains of the fire. Bodhi's camera on its tripod. Everything exactly as they had left it. Ronan's gear was not there. Not gone. Not taken. Not left behind. Simply not there. As if it had never been there. As if Ronan had never set foot in this clearing. They searched for 3 hours. They called his name until their voices were raw. They walked grid patterns through the forest, pressing into the trees, moving along the riverbank. They found nothing. Kieran called for help on the emergency satellite communicator he had insisted on bringing despite Maddox telling him he was being paranoid. Search and rescue came in the next morning. 40 people. Dogs. Helicopters working the ridgeline. They found no trace of Ronan. Not a boot print. Not a scrap of clothing. Nothing. The investigation opened and did not close for many months. It is technically still open. But that was not what broke Aveline in the years that followed. What broke her was reviewing the camera footage again months later, when the investigators asked them to go through it frame by frame. In the sequence where all 4 of them stand motionless around the tent in the dark, they had always assumed the camera was too far away to see their faces clearly. Frame by frame it turned out you could. 3 of them were facing outward, eyes open, expressions completely blank. 1 of them was facing inward, facing the tent. His face was not blank. His expression was something that did not belong on any face Aveline had ever seen on any person she had ever loved. The investigators noted in their report that the footage was inconclusive. Aveline requested that the file be deleted. She stopped sleeping with the lights off. She never went camping again. Story 13. The Woman Under the Bed. Emberly was 4 years old when she first told them about the woman. She came downstairs one Saturday morning while Theron and his wife Valencia were sitting at the kitchen table with their coffee, still in that soft blurry state of early weekend morning, and she climbed up onto the chair between them and said, in her clear, precise 4-year-old voice, "The lady under my bed was awake again last night." Valencia set down her coffee cup. She looked at Theron. Theron looked back at her. "What lady, sweetheart?" Valencia said. "The one that lives there," Emberly said simply, reaching for a piece of toast. "She's been there a long time. She doesn't like the light." They did what all reasonable parents do when a 4-year-old says something like this. They exchanged a look over Emberly's head that communicated both this is probably just imagination and also please go check under her bed, and then they gently asked a few more questions that Emberly answered with the frustrating brevity of small children who do not understand why grown-ups need so many details about things that are simply obvious. The lady was tall. She had long hair. She came out at night sometimes and walked around the room. She did not talk, but she made a sound like breathing. Theron went upstairs and checked under the bed. Thus, a missing sock. A board book Emberly had been asking about for 2 weeks. Nothing else. He checked the closet. The window lock. The small storage space in the eaves that opened off the back wall of Emberly's room. Nothing. Imagination, he said to Valencia as he came back downstairs. Probably, Valencia agreed. But she refilled her coffee cup and held it with both hands and did not quite relax for the rest of the morning. Emberly mentioned the woman again a week later. And then again the week after that. Always the same details. Tall. Long hair. Didn't like the light. Breathed. Walked around the room at night. Sometimes stood at the end of the bed and looked at Emberly, and Emberly said this without any particular distress, the way you might mention that the neighbor's cat sat on your fence. They took her to see a child psychologist. The psychologist said that imaginary companions were entirely normal for children Emberly's age, that the specific quality of the figure, its consistency of detail, simply indicated a more vivid imagination than average. She was not distressed. She was not showing any signs of anxiety or trauma. She was thriving. They redecorated her room. New paint. New bedding. They moved the bed away from the wall. They installed a night light that stayed on all night. They made a ritual of checking under the bed together every evening, Theron kneeling down with a flashlight and making a show of looking in every corner while Emberly stood with her arms crossed watching him, and this became a thing they did, a part of bedtime, a small performance of safety. The woman, Emberly told them, still came. "She doesn't like your flashlight," Emberly told Theron one evening as he straightened up from the nightly check. "She moves to the corner when you do that." Theron looked at the corner. The corner was empty. "There's nothing there, Em," he said gently. Emberly looked at him with the patient expression of someone who knows they will not be believed but feels obligated to try anyway. "She's there when you leave," she said. 6 months passed. The woman visits became a fixture of their life, disturbing but distant, like a crack in a wall you have learned to stop looking at. Emberly did not seem frightened. She spoke of the woman the way she spoke of the fish in the pond at her grandmother's house, something that was simply there, a feature of the landscape of her world. And then one night Valencia woke up at 3 a.m. She woke without knowing why. No sound had woken her, no movement, nothing she could identify. She simply opened her eyes and was fully, absolutely awake, and her heart was hammering. She lay very still and let her eyes adjust to the dark. The bedroom was quiet. Theron breathing beside her. The digital clock on the nightstand. The faint orange glow of street lights at the edges of the curtains. Everything normal. Everything exactly as it should be. She started to relax. And then she saw the hand. It was coming from under the bed. From under her side of the bed, the side she slept on, where the duvet hung down to about 6 inches from the floor. In the darkness under there, pale and long-fingered, a hand had reached out and wrapped itself around the edge of the hanging duvet, and was slowly, steadily pulling it downward. Valencia did not scream. She did not scream because the scream lodged itself somewhere in her chest and would not come loose. She could not move. She lay rigid on her back, every muscle locked, watching the duvet inch downward as whatever was under the bed pulled it slowly, patiently, without any urgency at all. The hand was an adult hand, not a child's. Long fingers, very pale, the nails slightly too long. It moved with a slow, deliberate purpose. Then Theron shifted in his sleep beside her, rolling over, and the hand stopped. For 3 full seconds nothing moved. Then the hand released the duvet and withdrew back into the darkness under the bed with a slowness that was somehow worse than if it had been fast. Valencia screamed. She told Theron what she had seen while he checked under the bed and found nothing, while he checked the whole room and found nothing, while she sat on the bed with both feet pulled up and off the floor and her back pressed against the headboard and her voice shaking. He believed her. He did not say he believed her. He said all the reasonable things, light and shadows, half asleep, the mind plays tricks, but his face when he said them was the face of a man who believed her and was afraid. They called the police. The officers who came were thorough and kind and found nothing unusual in the house. No sign of entry. No sign that anyone had been there. The house was secure. They moved Emberly into their room that night. They lay with the lights on, all 3 of them in the big bed, and waited for morning. In the morning, while Valencia made breakfast and Theron drank coffee and tried to look like a person who had not spent the night rigid with fear, Emberly stood in the doorway of her empty bedroom and looked at the bed. "She's gone," Emberly said. "What?" Theron said. "The lady," Emberly said. "She's not here anymore. She was really upset last night. About something." She tilted her head, looking at the space under the bed. "I think she's gone now though." She paused. "I think she found somewhere else to stay." They sold the house 8 months later. They told the buyers it was a relocation for work. The night before they moved out, Theron went into Emberly's empty room alone. The room was bare. Just bare walls and bare floor and late afternoon light coming through the window. He stood there for a long time. Then he crouched down. He got all the way down to the floor and pressed his cheek against the bare floorboard and looked under the bed frame. Empty. Just floorboards. But the space under the frame smelled damp. Like earth. Like something that had been still and dark in a small space for a very long time. He stood up. He turned off the light. He did not look back. Story 14. The Elevator Game. It had been Naira's idea. She had found it on one of those forum threads that goes around every Halloween, lists of paranormal rituals and urban legends and things people have supposedly done and survived. Most of them were obvious nonsense. But the elevator game caught her attention with its specific rules and its specific promised outcome, and she had screenshot it and sent it to the group chat at midnight with the message, "Who's doing this with me this weekend?" Caspian responded with immediate enthusiasm. Marlowe sent 3 question marks and then a yes. Alaric, who prided himself on being the skeptical one, sent a voice message explaining exactly why this was all made-up nonsense designed for credulous people, and then ended the voice message with, "I'll drive." The 4th in their group was Kieran, who simply sent a thumbs up and went back to whatever he had been doing. The rules of the elevator game were specific. You needed a building of at least 10 floors. You needed an elevator. You needed to ride alone. You went up and down in a precise sequence of floors, and if you did everything correctly, the elevator would stop at a floor that was not supposed to be there, and a woman would get in, and you were under no circumstances supposed to speak to or look at the woman, and if you pressed the button for the first floor you would be taken somewhere else, and to get back you had to repeat the sequence. They found their building in downtown Vancouver. An old residential tower that had been decommissioned and was waiting on a development permit, 14 floors of empty corridors and dark apartments, and the musty particular smell of a building that had been human and was no longer. Getting in had been Caspian's department. He had a talent, as Naira put it diplomatically, for finding ways into places that did not particularly want to be found. He found an unlocked service entrance on the ground floor. They went in on a Friday evening in October, just as the light was going that deep late afternoon gold that turns everything slightly unreal. The lobby was dim and dusty. The elevator was old, the kind with a single button panel and doors that opened in 2 parts. The floor counter above the door still worked, its orange number ticking as the car moved. They stood around it. 4 of them, flashlights, the particular electric atmosphere of something that is half game and half dare and you are not quite sure where the boundary is between the two. "Okay," Naira said. "Who's first?" There was a silence. "I'll go," Kieran said. He went in alone. Naira read the floor sequence from her phone screen. 4th floor. 2nd floor. 6th floor. 2nd floor. 10th floor. 5th floor. 1st floor. Wait. If a woman gets in, do not look at her or speak to her. Press the button for the 1st floor and if the elevator goes to the 10th floor instead of the 1st, you have arrived somewhere else. To get back, repeat the sequence. The elevator doors closed. The 3 of them stood in the lobby and watched the orange number above the door tick through the sequence. 4, 2, 6, 2, 10, 5, 1. They waited. The number stayed at 1. Then the doors opened and Kieran walked out, looking slightly anticlimactic, and said, "Nothing." "Expected," Alaric said. "My turn," Naira said. She went through the same sequence. She came back out looking flushed and laughing. "Okay, the 10 floors alone in the dark is genuinely creepy," she admitted. But nothing happened. Marlo went next. Same result. "Your turn," Naira said to Alaric. "Absolutely not," Alaric said. "You said you'd do it if we all did it." "I said no such thing." The voice message. "You literally." "I will listen to no such." "Fine." He got in the elevator. He turned around and faced the front, his expression the particular expression of someone determined to prove a point. The doors closed. They watched the counter. 4th, 2nd, 6th, 2nd, 5th, 5th, 1. The doors did not open. The number stayed at 1. For 30 seconds. 45. Naira pressed the call button. Nothing. "Alaric," she called. No response. Caspian found the stairwell door and ran up to the first floor. There was a first floor. The building only had a basement and then floors 1 through 14. There was no lobby level, just a ground floor that was technically below street level. The elevator was at floor 1. The doors were stuck. He could hear movement inside. A shuffling sound. Then silence. He pried the doors open with a length of pipe he found in the stairwell. Alaric was standing in the back corner of the elevator facing the wall. "Alaric," Caspian said. Alaric turned around. He was fine. He looked perfectly fine. A little pale, but who wouldn't be? He said the doors had jammed and it had been dark and he had pressed himself to the back and waited and it was fine, it was nothing, the ritual was obviously nonsense and the building's elevator was obviously old and faulty, and could they please leave? They left. They went to get food at a diner a few blocks away and they laughed about it and ordered too much and argued about whether any of it counted as paranormal, and Alaric was perfectly normal, laughed at all the right things, ate his food, argued with good-humored energy. On the way home, Caspian stopped to use the bathroom at a gas station. He washed his hands and looked in the mirror above the sink. He was standing beside Alaric. In the mirror, Alaric was not smiling. He turned around. Alaric was smiling. Normal smile. Nothing unusual. He looked in the mirror again. In the mirror, Alaric was not smiling. He told himself it was a trick of the light. The fluorescent flickering above the sink. He did not sleep well that night and he told himself that was why, when he drove Alaric home and they said goodbye and he watched Alaric walk up his front path, he did not quite feel like the shape of the person walking away was quite the right shape. He called Naira the next morning. He told her about the mirror. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I was looking in my compact on the way to the car," she said slowly. "I thought I was imagining it." "What did you see?" Another pause. "His reflection was looking at me," she said. "Like looking directly at me in the mirror. But he was talking to Marlo. He wasn't looking at either of us." Caspian's hands tightened on the phone. "Did you notice his eyes?" he asked. "In the reflection?" "Yes." A long silence. "They were the wrong color," she said quietly. "I thought it was the mirror. Or the light. But they were the wrong color. They did not know what to do with this. There was nothing to do with this, really." Alaric functioned normally. He went to work, answered text, showed up to things. He was the same Alaric. Almost. Except for the mirrors. Every mirror, every reflective surface, every car window and shop front glass. The reflection of Alaric was slightly wrong. A different expression. Eyes moving independently. Watching things that were not in the right direction. They tried to tell him. They sat him down in a room with no mirrors and told him what they had been seeing, and Alaric listened politely and carefully and said that it sounded like they were both under significant stress and perhaps should see someone. His voice was completely level. His eyes were completely still. Naira got out her compact and held it up. In the reflection behind where Alaric was sitting, a second version of Alaric was standing. It was smiling. She closed the compact. She looked at Alaric. Alaric was not smiling. Whatever came back from that elevator, it wore Alaric very well. But reflections do not lie. And whatever was in Alaric's reflection had been in that building for a long time, wearing other faces before his, patient and quiet behind every polished surface, looking out. Story 15. I took a job watching security cameras. It was a straightforward job. That was what the agency told Bodhi when they placed him. An overnight security monitoring position at a commercial property complex in an industrial district outside of Brisbane, Australia. 6 buildings. 43 cameras. A control room the size of a large walk-in closet, with a wall of monitors and a chair that was ergonomically designed by someone who clearly hated spines. Standard hours: midnight to 6, Monday through Friday. Nothing was expected to happen. Nothing ever happened. The previous monitor had left due to relocation, not any incident. Bodhi needed the money. He took the job. The first 2 weeks were exactly what had been promised. Absolutely nothing. He sat in the chair and watched 43 feeds of empty car parks and loading bays and fire exits and the long straight access road that ran down the center of the complex, and he drank bad coffee from a machine in the hallway, and he listened to podcasts through one earbud, and he thought about what he would do with his life when he had enough saved to go back to university. The figure appeared on the 16th night. Camera 14. Loading bay of Building 3. 1:23 a.m. A shadow in the corner of the frame. The camera was pointed at the wide roller door of the loading bay, and in the deep shadow at the left edge of the frame, where the building's overhang created a pocket of darkness that the floodlights didn't quite reach, something was standing. It was human-shaped. Just, the proportions were not quite right in a way that was hard to define, a slight elongation, a stillness that was not the stillness of a person but the stillness of something that was very good at not moving. It stood in the shadow and it did not move and it faced the camera. Bodhi leaned forward. He zoomed in as much as the system allowed. The image quality degraded. The shape became pixelated and harder to read, not easier. He picked up the phone and called the on-site security officer, a patrol guard named Theron who did 2 walkthroughs per night in a small electric cart. Theron went to loading bay 3. He reported nothing. No one. The bay was empty. He checked the side of the building, the access road, the space under the overhang where the shadow had been. Empty. Camera 14 showed the bay empty on the feed now too. The shadow was gone. The overhang was just an overhang. Bodhi wrote it in the log. Unidentified shape, camera 14, 1:23 a.m. Investigated. Nothing found. Probable shadow or light artifact. He went back to his podcast. But he kept glancing at camera 14. 3 nights later. Camera 22. South face of building 5. 1:23 a.m. again. The same figure. Same proportions. Same stillness. Different camera, different location, same dark space at the edge of the frame where the light did not quite reach. This time Bodhi did not call Theron immediately. He watched. For 4 minutes he watched the shape standing there in the shadow at the edge of camera 22's frame. It did not move. Not a shift of weight, not a turn of the head, not the slight constant restlessness that every standing human body has. Then at 1:27 it was simply gone. Not gone like it walked away. Gone like one frame it was there and the next frame it was not. He called Theron. Theron checked. Nothing. Bodhi went back through the footage from camera 14 on the 16th night. He found the exact frame where the figure disappeared. Same thing. One frame present. Next frame, empty shadow. He started keeping a second log. Unofficial. A notebook he kept in his jacket pocket. Every sighting recorded by camera number, timestamp, duration. The figure appeared every night. Camera by camera it was getting closer. Not in a way he could see happening. He never saw it move between cameras. He never saw it on any intermediate feed. He would see it on camera 22, call Theron, wait, find nothing. Then the following night it would appear on a camera that was closer to the control room. Camera 31. Camera 36. Camera 39. Each camera closer than the last. Each appearance at 1:23 a.m. Each one for exactly 4 minutes. Bodhi pulled up the building plans from the filing cabinet in the corner. He overlaid the camera positions in his notebook, drawing a rough map, marking each appearance with a dot and a date. The dots formed a line. A straight line. Pointing directly at the control room. He called his supervisor. He emailed the building manager. He was professional and matter-of-fact and attached screenshots. The response was polite and dismissive. Camera artifact. Light anomaly. The feeds were old, there was known distortion on several cameras. It was nothing. On the 38th night, the figure appeared on camera 42. Camera 42 was mounted on the exterior wall of the corridor that led to the control room. It was pointed down the corridor toward the main complex, away from the control room door, so it showed the corridor from the outside in. From where the figure stood in the shadow at the edge of camera 42's frame, the control room door would be approximately 12 meters behind it. Bodhi looked at the monitor showing camera 42. He looked at the shadow at the edge of the frame. Then he looked at the door of the control room. The door was a heavy metal fire door. It was closed. It was always closed. He kept it closed because the hallway was cold and the control room was small enough to hold heat. He watched camera 42. The figure stood in its corner. Did not move. Faced the camera. Bodhi did not move. He sat in the chair and watched camera 42 and did not move. At 1:27 a.m. the figure was gone. He let out a breath he had not known he was holding. He opened his notebook. He wrote camera 42, the date, the time, 4 minutes. Then he looked at his map. There were 43 cameras in the complex. He had recorded sightings on 42 of them. He looked at the door. He did not get up. He did not open the door. At 1:29 a.m., camera 43 came online. Camera 43 was not in the system. It was not on his official camera list. It was not on the building plans. It appeared on the monitor wall in a space that had previously displayed the system clock, pushing the clock display to a secondary position, as if it had always been there. The feed from camera 43 showed the inside of the control room. It showed Bodhi sitting in his chair. And in the far corner of the control room, behind him, standing in the shadow where the overhead light didn't quite reach. He did not turn around. He kept his eyes on the monitor. The shape in the corner of camera 43 did not move. At 1:33 a.m., Bodhi stood up, picked up his jacket, his notebook, his coffee, and walked to the door. He opened the door. He walked down the corridor. He walked out of the building, got in his car, and drove away. He never went back. His notebook, which he had left on the chair without realizing it, was logged as lost property by the replacement monitor who started the following Monday. The replacement monitor lasted 11 days before also leaving suddenly. The agency had some difficulty filling the position after that. Story 16. The Deep Web Challenge. Maddox had been streaming for 4 years. He had built his following the old way, incrementally, horror gameplay throughs and reaction videos, and the kind of easy, comfortable personality that made people feel like they were hanging out with a friend rather than watching content. He had 340,000 subscribers. Enough to live on. Enough to matter. Not enough, apparently, for the message he received on a Tuesday night in November. It came through an obscure forum he occasionally visited for horror content ideas. A direct message from an account he did not recognize, username a string of random characters that changed every time he checked it, as if it were regenerating. The message was brief. We have a challenge for you. $50,000 for one night. Private stream. We send the setup. You broadcast. Rules will be explained when you agree. He posted it in his Discord as a curiosity, half expecting his community to immediately identify it as a scam. Several of them said scam immediately. But others started digging, and what they found was strange. The forum account had previous interactions with 2 other streamers, both of whom had received similar messages, both of whom had agreed, and both of whom had posted nothing about it afterward. One had a recent video where he briefly referenced an interesting experience he wasn't ready to talk about yet, before the topic was dropped entirely. Maddox was curious. Maddox was also, underneath the curiosity, aware of the particular math of $50,000. He agreed. The setup arrived by courier 3 days later. A custom streaming kit in a black case. A dedicated laptop. A camera. A microphone. A small device he did not recognize that the accompanying card described only as a network router. Instructions. Set everything up in your home, go live on the provided platform at midnight on Friday, tell no viewers in advance. He set it up in his living room. He went live at midnight on a Friday. The platform was like nothing he had used before. No interface he recognized. A black screen with a viewer count in the corner. By 12:05 the count was at 4,200. By 12:10 it was at 9,000. At 12:15 a.m. text appeared at the bottom of his screen. Welcome Maddox. You are being watched by 9,441 viewers. Tonight they will vote. You will comply. Are you ready to begin? He hesitated for a long moment, reading it twice. Then he said to the camera, in the voice he used when he was starting a horror playthrough, let's find out. The first few challenges were manageable. Stay in the dark for 15 minutes. Open every door in the house and leave them open. Turn off all the lights in the house and sit in the center of the living room floor. He did them. The viewers voted on each challenge through a system he couldn't see, results appearing on his screen as a percentage. 78% chose this option over that one. Around 2 a.m. the challenges shifted. Viewers have voted. Go to your basement. Do not turn on the light. Maddox did not have a basement. He told them this. The screen read, viewers have voted. Check again. He laughed. He said to the camera he had lived in this apartment for 3 years and there was no basement. He said it the way you say something when you are sure and don't need to check because you're sure. Then he went to the kitchen to get water, and on the way back he passed the door. The door at the end of the hallway, which he knew was a storage cupboard, had always been a storage cupboard. He had put boxes in it when he moved in. He had not opened it in perhaps a year. He opened it. A staircase went down. He stood in the doorway for a long time looking at the stairs. They were wooden. They were worn. They went down into darkness. He had never been down these stairs. He had not known these stairs existed. He told the camera what he was seeing. His voice was controlled but not entirely. He described the stairs, the darkness below, the smell coming up from below which was cold and earthy and old. The screen, viewers have voted, 94% say go down. He went down. The basement was real. Concrete walls. A bare concrete floor. A single socket on one wall with no bulb in it. Nothing in the room. No stored boxes from previous tenants, no old furniture, nothing that should have been in a basement that had existed under an occupied building for decades. In the center of the floor was a circle, drawn in something dark and dried. Inside the circle, in a careful arrangement, were objects. Small objects. Things that he recognized. His keyring. His exact keyring with his specific keys and the worn enamel tag he'd had since he was a teenager. A photograph. A specific photograph that had been in a drawer in his bedroom. A photograph of him and his family taken years ago that had never been online and no one would have access to unless they had been in his home. He stopped describing what he was seeing. He held the camera at the circle and just stood there, and the viewer count on his screen jumped to 11,200. The text appeared, "Final challenge. Viewers have voted. 11,200 viewers get to decide what enters your house tonight. Majority rules. Voting opens now. Closes at 3 a.m. A timer in the corner of his screen. 47 minutes. He stood in that basement with the timer running and 11,200 viewers voting on something entering his home and his own keys sitting in a circle on the concrete floor, and he made a decision. He picked up the custom laptop. He found the network cable that connected it to the unknown router. He pulled the cable out. The stream cut immediately. He sat in the dark for a moment. Then he went back upstairs. He called a friend. He waited until daylight with every light in the apartment on and did not go back into the hallway. In the morning he called the building manager and asked about the basement. The building manager said the building did not have a basement. The ground level was built on a concrete slab. There was no below-ground access. The door at the end of the hallway opened to a storage cupboard. Always had. Maddox stood in front of it for a long time. Then he opened it. A storage cupboard. Shelves. His boxes. His winter coats. The vacuum cleaner. Everything exactly as it should be. His keys were on the hook by the front door where they always were. He checked every drawer in his bedroom. The photograph was in the third drawer. Exactly where it had been. He posted nothing about this experience. He returned to his regular streaming schedule within the week. He was funny and warm and normal and did not reference that Friday night. But he had the custom equipment examined by a tech-savvy friend. The laptop had extensive spyware. Everything in his home had been accessed. His contacts, his files, his email, his calendar detailing where he would be and when. The network router was broadcasting to an IP address that no one was able to trace. He never received a follow-up message. He never received the $50,000. He moved to a new apartment the following month. He never told his viewers why. The timer on the stream had reached 0. He often thought about what the 11,200 people had voted for. He thought about it especially on the nights when he heard sounds from the hallway. Sounds he told himself were the building settling, old pipes, the usual percussion of a lived-in place. He tried very hard to believe that. Story 17. The empty school hallway. Dorian had been a janitor at the school for 7 years before it closed. He had worked there when it was full. He had known its sounds, the particular acoustic signature of 200 children moving between classes, the specific echo of the gymnasium, the way the staff room door squealed on its hinges. He had known every corner of it, and it had been, despite its age and its drafty windows and its perpetually malfunctioning heating system, a place that felt warm in the most literal sense that had nothing to do with temperature. He took the post-closure job because the money was steady and because, he told himself, he was being sentimental about an empty building. The school board needed someone to do maintenance rounds twice a week through the decommissioned building while they figured out what to do with the property. Dorian figured it would be straightforward and a little melancholy, and that was fine. The building had been closed for 3 years when he started. The first sign was the sounds. He heard them on his second week. His Tuesday rounds, late afternoon, moving through the ground floor corridor with his cart. He heard laughing. Children laughing, the specific bubble and tumble of it from somewhere above him. He stood still and listened. He went upstairs. The first floor corridor was empty. Of course it was empty. The lockers still lined the walls, left behind because removal had seemed more trouble than it was worth, and the classroom doors stood open on their silent rooms, chairs stacked, boards still bearing ghost traces of old equations and vocabulary lists, and no children anywhere. He went back to his rounds and told himself it was the pipes. The building's heating system, even dormant, tended to move air through the old ductwork in ways that created unusual sounds. He had heard stranger things from the boiler room. This was not strange. This was a building being a building. 3 weeks later he heard it again. The same corridor. The same bright tumbling laughter. This time he caught something else underneath it. Movement. The soft shuffle of feet on linoleum. He stood at the end of the corridor and listened, and it was coming from the far end, from the turn of the corridor where it bent toward the old library. He walked toward it. The sound did not stop as he approached, which was what you might expect if it were a trick of acoustics or the pipes. Sounds that changed as you moved through the space. Stayed exactly the same. Exactly ahead of him. He turned the corner. The corridor was empty. He went home that night and poured himself a drink and sat at his kitchen table with his laptop and looked up information about the school's history the way he had not done before, because he had told himself it was just a building. He found out that the school had not simply been decommissioned due to declining enrollment, as he had been told. There had been an incident. 9 years ago, several years before the school closed. An accident in the gymnasium. 3 children had been badly hurt, 1 had been taken to hospital. The school had remained open, but the gymnasium had been closed, and it was only after an unrelated structural assessment had flagged issues with the foundation that the decision to decommission the entire building had been made. The details of the accident were not in the newspaper archives he could access. The school board had never publicly described what had happened. He went back for his Friday rounds. He brought a torch instead of relying on the corridor lights. He also, as an afterthought, checked the security system. The school still had its original camera setup, 10 cameras throughout the building, connected to a recording unit in the administration office that ran on a timer. No one monitored them actively. They simply recorded. He plugged in a screen to the recording unit and checked that it was working. It was. He did his rounds without incident. He heard nothing. The following Tuesday he returned. Before starting his rounds he went to the administration office and pulled the footage from the previous Friday night. He found what he was looking for at 11:34 p.m., almost 5 hours after he had left. The corridor camera, the one pointing down the first floor hallway toward the library turn. It showed the empty corridor exactly as he knew it, lockers, open doors, the flat dark of a building with no lights on. And then, standing in the corridor at the far end, 7 figures. Children. Standing in the corridor. 7 of them, arranged in a loose cluster, all facing the camera. They were not moving. They were simply standing there, at 11:34 p.m. in a building that had been locked and empty for 3 years, standing completely still, facing the camera. Dorian played the footage forward. They stood there for 1 hour and 12 minutes. Then they were gone. 1 frame present. The next frame, empty corridor. He called the police the following morning. He was calm and methodical about it. He showed them the footage. The officers reviewed it and were visibly uncomfortable. They walked through the building and found nothing, no signs of entry, no footprints in the dust on the floor, nothing that indicated anyone had been inside. The camera could be malfunctioning, one of them offered. All 10 cameras were functioning normally, Dorian said. This footage is from camera 7. You can check cameras 1 through 6 and 8 through 10 for comparison. They checked. The figures appeared on every camera that had a view of a corridor. Every camera. At the same time. For the same duration. 7 children standing silently in every corridor of the building simultaneously. 2 of the officers resigned from the force within the year. Dorian was told this by a colleague of theirs he met by chance at a petrol station, who looked at him with a particular expression and said, "You're the one who showed them that footage, aren't you?" He said yes. The man nodded slowly. "They don't sleep right," he said. "Not since." Dorian reviewed the footage again. Himself, alone in the administration office, on a gray Thursday afternoon. He looked very closely at the children's faces this time. He had been in this school for 7 years. He knew every face that had moved through its corridors. He was good with faces, remembered them, kept them. He recognized 3 of the children in the footage. He had known them when they were alive. He submitted his resignation the following day. The school board thanked him for his years of service and did not ask why he was leaving. No one, Dorian noticed, ever asked why the night janitors left. The building is still standing. The development permit has been delayed for years, trapped in bureaucratic processes that no one seems able to resolve despite all parties expressing desire to move forward. People who have been involved in the assessment process have reported, variously, that the building doesn't feel right, and that they had trouble concentrating while inside it and that they would prefer future assessments be conducted during daylight hours. The security cameras, as far as Dorian knows, are still recording. He has not gone back to check the footage. He does not intend to. Story 18. My Uber driver wouldn't stop smiling. Zarael had been at the gallery opening until almost midnight. It had been a good night. The kind of night that reminds you why you moved to a city, all those warm-lit rooms and new faces and the particular energy of a space full of people who are genuinely pleased to be somewhere. She had 2 glasses of wine, talked to several interesting people she had not met before, and when the crowd began to thin around 11:30 she called a car and stepped outside into the cool Edinburgh night feeling light and content. The confirmation came through. 3 minutes away. A dark sedan. Driver name. A string of characters her phone rendered oddly, like a character encoding error. Rating, 4.7. She waited on the pavement. The car pulled up. She got in. The driver was a man. She registered that vaguely. Average height from what she could see in the front seat. Dark coat. Hands on the wheel. Zarael, he said. Yes, she said. She pulled up her phone to confirm the route. She looked up when the car didn't move. The driver was looking at her in the rearview mirror. He was smiling. It was a very wide smile. Not the kind of professional, neutral smile of someone doing a service job and making polite eye contact. This was a specific, fixed smile, the kind of smile you saw in photographs where someone had not been able to change their expression in time for the shutter. Stretch. Absolute. Showing the full width of his teeth. Long way, he said. Just Marchmont, she said. It should be about 15 minutes. The driver nodded. The smile did not change. He pulled out into traffic. She told herself she was being paranoid. It was late. She was tired. People had unusual smiles, that was simply a fact of the world, and she was reading threat into a facial expression because she was a woman alone in a car at midnight and that was just the constant low-level arithmetic of being a woman alone in a car at midnight, nothing more. She watched the route on her phone. It was correct. The blue line threading through Edinburgh streets in the right direction, the estimated time, the route she knew through the south side, down toward Marchmont. Then the line moved. She watched it happen on the screen. The route recalculating. The blue line bending away from Marchmont, from the south side, from any direction she recognized. The new route pointing toward the east, toward the waterfront, toward the industrial district that sat between the city and the docks. The route changed, she said. The driver was silent. Excuse me, she said, her voice perfectly steady. The route just changed. I need you to take the Marchmont route. The driver's eyes appeared in the rearview mirror. The smile had not changed. Had not dimmed or shifted or become less absolute. In the dark of the car interior it was a fixed white line. They're waiting for us, he said. His voice was completely flat. Not unkind. Not threatening in its tone, just flat. The way you might read a weather forecast aloud. Zarael unlocked her phone. She called her friend Lyanna, who had also been at the gallery, who lived in the south side. She kept her voice normal when Lyanna picked up, kept her eyes on the rearview mirror and the driver's eyes in it. Hey, she said. I'm in an Uber, I'm going to be about 20 minutes. Can you stay on the phone? I'm going to tell you the streets as we pass them. She had read once that this was the right thing to do. Lyanna, who was perceptive in the way of someone who had known Zarael for 11 years, said immediately, Of course. I'm right here. Talk to me. We just passed the Pleasance, Zarael said. This was not true. They had not passed the Pleasance. They were nowhere near the Pleasance. But she said it anyway. Got it? Lyanna said. I'm tracking. Zarael looked at the driver. He had not blinked. She was watching his eyes in the mirror and she realized with a crawling certainty that he had not blinked since she got into the car. I need you to stop the car, she said. The driver said nothing. Stop the car, please. Nothing. Stop the car right now. She gripped the door handle. The car was moving at city speed, not fast, but the road was unlit now, the waterfront area, and the streetlights were thin and far apart. Please, Lyanna said in her ear. What street are you on? I don't know, Zarael said quietly. Okay, Lioness said, and her voice was calm and deliberate. "I've called the police. I need you to do something for me. Can you unlock the door?" The car slowed. Zarel did not know why. No traffic ahead. No signal. The driver simply reduced speed, and in the mirror his eyes remained on hers and the smile did not waver, and she felt the full weight of how wrong everything was pressing in from all sides. She pulled the handle and pushed the door. She was out while the car was still moving, and she ran. She ran in the direction of the nearest light she could see, a street lamp 100 meters back toward the city, and she kept going until she reached a road she recognized and then a shop with its lights still on and a person inside behind the counter who looked up when she came in and, to his credit, immediately said, "Are you all right?" She was not all right, but she was safe. The police were there within 12 minutes. She gave them everything she had from the app. Driver name, vehicle plate, the route as she had tracked it. The plate came back registered to a vehicle that had been reported stolen the previous week. The driver account had been created 48 hours earlier using false information. They did not find the car that night. They found it the following morning, parked in a lot near the waterfront. Empty. No signs of anyone having been in it recently, no fingerprints, nothing. The destination the GPS had been routing to was an abandoned commercial property at the end of a service road near the docks. The police would say only that they had investigated the property and that investigations were ongoing. Zarel did not look it up. She called Liana from the police station and Liana cried, which made Zarel cry, and they sat on the phone for a long time afterward in the way you do when you have been frightened and the fright has passed and you just need to hear another person's breathing. She still takes Ubers sometimes. There is no practical alternative in a city of that size. But she always checks the mirrors first now. And she keeps Liana's number open in her hand, her thumb over the call button, until she is home and the door is locked behind her. She still thinks about the smile. The absolute fixity of it. The way it did not change when she spoke to him, when she refused, when she got out of the car. Not a flicker. She thinks about the fact that he did not blink. She thinks about the words, "They're waiting for us." She thinks about what would have happened if the car had not slowed. She thinks about this and then she stops thinking about it, firmly and deliberately, the way you close a door on a dark room. She leaves the light on when she sleeps. Story 19. The mirror reflection. It started on a Tuesday. Caspian was brushing his teeth in the bathroom mirror, half awake, the way you do in the first minutes of the morning when your brain is still in a different time zone from your body, and he moved the toothbrush to the left side of his mouth and watched the reflection do the same thing and felt the small pleasant reassurance of your own face being where it should be. Then the reflection moved to the right side. A second later. Not simultaneously. Not as a mirror should. A second behind, a full conscious feeling second, as if the reflection had a slight delay between receiving instructions and executing them. He stopped. He stared. He moved his hand to the left. The reflection moved its hand to the left. But the timing was wrong. Just wrong enough to notice. He told himself it was his vision. Early morning, without his glasses yet, a slight astigmatism he'd had since childhood. He put his glasses on and went back to the mirror. His reflection looked back at him. He moved his hand. The reflection moved its hand. Simultaneous. He stood there for a moment, staring at himself, and felt vaguely embarrassed at how spooked he had gotten by his own face. He went to school. He was 17, studying for his A-levels at a school outside of London, living in the same house he had grown up in a quiet suburb where the most supernatural thing that typically happened was the neighbor's cat getting into the bird feeder. It happened again on Thursday. Same bathroom. Same morning. This time he was awake enough to be certain he was seeing it correctly. He moved his hand. The reflection moved its hand a second later. He turned his head. The reflection turned its head a second later. He did it deliberately, methodically. He raised and lowered his arm. Every movement the reflection did after him. 1 second. Every time. He counted it out. 1 Mississippi. And then the reflection caught up. He went to school and said nothing about it because there was no one to say it to that would not result in a very unpleasant kind of attention. By the following week it was 3 seconds. And on Thursday of that week he raised his arm and held it there, and the reflection raised its arm after the delay and then held it there too, and he lowered his arm and the reflection did not lower its arm. He stood and looked at his reflection holding its arm up while his arm was down, and his reflection looked back at him, and his reflection's face was doing something his face was not doing. It was smiling. His face in the mirror was smiling. His face was not smiling. He was not smiling. He was, if anything, as far from smiling as he had ever been while still technically conscious and upright. But the face in the mirror wore a small, closed expression that on another person he would have called amusement. He turned away from the mirror. He went to school. He told his friend Ronan, who was also studying at the same school and who had a higher tolerance for unusual things than most people. He described exactly what had been happening. Ronan listened very carefully in the way he always did, without interrupting, and then said, "Is it doing it in other mirrors too?" Caspian had not thought to check other mirrors. They went to a department store on the weekend. A large one with a lot of reflective surfaces, fitting room mirrors, the long mirrors in the clothing departments, the bathroom mirrors near the back. Ronan walked slightly behind Caspian and watched the reflections as they passed. On the third mirror, Ronan put his hand on Caspian's arm. "Don't look right now," he said quietly. Caspian did not look. "What is it?" "Your reflection is looking at me," Ronan said. "Not at you. At me. You're looking straight ahead and it's looking directly at me." Caspian said, still looking forward, "Is it smiling?" Pause. "Yes," Ronan said. They left the shop. They sat on a bench outside and did not say anything for a while. Pigeons. Traffic. The sound of the city going about its business with no interest in what had just happened in the fitting room mirror aisle. "Okay," Ronan said finally. "What do we do?" "I don't know," Caspian said. They looked things up, collectively and separately. There was an enormous amount of folklore and superstition around mirrors, most of it contradictory, none of it useful in quite the specific way they needed. They found references to mirrors as portals, as traps for spirits, as objects that retained images of the dead, as gateways between worlds. None of it told them what to do about a reflection that was running late and smiling at things it shouldn't be. Caspian covered the bathroom mirror with a towel. He covered every mirror in his room. He avoided reflective surfaces when he could, and when he couldn't he kept his eyes forward. This worked, in the sense that he stopped seeing the reflections' delayed movements and wrong expressions. It did not work in the sense that it solved anything. Because 3 weeks into the covered mirrors, he was washing dishes at the kitchen sink and he looked down at the window above the sink, at the dark glass of it reflecting the kitchen interior back at him, and he saw himself standing at the sink washing the dishes. And in the dark glass reflection, just behind where he stood, the reflection of something else was standing. It was him. Another version of him. Standing a meter behind his reflection, in the space of the reflected kitchen, watching. He turned around. The kitchen was empty. He turned back to the window. The reflection behind his reflection looked at him. It smiled. He moved to his aunt's house. He did not tell his parents why. He said it was to be closer to a study group, a transparently thin excuse they accepted because teenagers say strange things for reasons adults have mostly given up trying to fully understand. At his aunt's house for 3 weeks, the mirrors were quiet. Simultaneous. Correct. His reflection did what he did when he did it. The face in the glass was his face. And then one morning he was passing the full-length mirror at the end of the upstairs hall, and out of the corner of his eye he saw the reflection. He stopped. He turned. He looked. His reflection looked back. Normal. Correct. Arms at his sides, face neutral, exactly him. But behind his reflection, barely visible at the edge of the mirror's frame, a hand was pressed against the glass. From the other side. He did not look away this time. He stood and looked at the hand. The fingers were pressed flat against the inside of the glass, pale, long-fingered. As he watched, they moved slowly, exploring the surface of the glass, as if feeling for an edge, for a way through. His reflection stood between him and the hand. His reflection turned its head slightly, and in a gesture that was unmistakably deliberate, unmistakably communicative, his reflection looked at the hand behind it, and then looked back at Caspian, and mouthed something, silently, clearly. 2 words. Caspian read them. He has never told anyone what they were. He covered every mirror in his aunt's house that day. He has not deliberately looked at his reflection in a mirror since. He is 23 now. He manages this with a carefulness that has become such a part of his daily life that he barely notices it anymore. Hotels and public bathrooms and gym changing rooms are navigated with a particular peripheral avoidance that his friends sometimes tease him about. He lets them tease. The alternative is the mirror. The alternative is the hand. The alternative is whatever is on the other side, learning the shape of the glass, patient and quiet, feeling for the place where the surface is thinnest. He is not ready for that. He does not know if he ever will be. Story 20. The town that disappeared. There were 5 of them, and the trip had been Lionel's idea. She was writing a thesis on abandoned communities in the Pacific Northwest, The small towns that had sprung up around logging or mining operations in the 19th century and then contracted and vanished when the industry moved on, leaving behind the architectural fossils of other people's ambitions. She had been documenting them for 2 years. She invited the others partly for company and partly because Brennan had a truck and Theron had a drone and Marlo had been asking about coming along for months. The fifth member of the group was Esme, who had a background in architectural history and who had initially declined and then texted at midnight 3 days before they left saying she had changed her mind. They drove out on a Friday morning in early September, heading into the interior of British Columbia, following logging roads that narrowed as they went further from the highway. Lyanna had found the town through a combination of historical survey records and a reference in a 1920s regional newspaper to a settlement called Grey Vale, population at its peak approximately 300. Established around a now-defunct silver mine. It was not on any map. Not on any modern map. She had found its approximate location through the intersection of several historical survey coordinates and a satellite image that showed, if you zoomed in carefully, what appeared to be a rectangular clearing in the forest with geometric shapes inside it that did not match the random patterning of natural growth. It took them 4 hours from the last paved road. They came over a rise in the logging track and the trees thinned and there it was. Grey Vale. It was more intact than anything Lyanna had ever found. In her experience, abandoned settlements at this age were foundations at best, occasional standing walls, the suggestion of structures in the pattern of overgrown clearings. Grey Vale had buildings. Standing, roofed, windowed buildings. A main street of them, perhaps 15 structures on each side, and behind them more buildings visible through gaps, residential structures, a larger building at the far end that might have been a community hall or a church. This shouldn't be standing, Theron said. No, Lyanna agreed. It shouldn't. The buildings were weathered but structurally sound. The windows were intact, glass still in the frames, the kind of thick old glass that warped your view through it. The doors were closed. The main street was overgrown but not as heavily as it should have been, the wild grasses and shrubs growing thickly but not the wall of vegetation you found in a place that had been truly abandoned for a century. They moved slowly down the main street. The shops still had their signage, or the ghost of it, painted directly onto the wooden facades in letters that were faded but legible. A general store. A hardware merchant. A physician. A hotel. Marlo tried the hotel door. It opened. Inside, a reception desk. A board of numbered hooks for keys. A staircase leading up. Floorboards that creaked but held. On the desk, a ledger. She opened it. The entries were in handwriting so carefully formed it looked almost printed, dates and names and room numbers going back to the 1890s. Come look at this, she said. The others crowded around the ledger. The entries went up to a final date, a Thursday in November 1923. After that, nothing. The page simply stopped at that entry and the remainder of the ledger was blank. Brennan took the drone out. He flew it up over the street while the others stood in the road and watched it rise, turning slowly, filming the rooftops, the layout of the town from above. When he brought it back and they reviewed the footage, the town was more extensive than it had appeared from the ground. Residential streets extending behind the main buildings, a network of them, dozens of houses. And at the far edge of the settlement, a large structure they had not walked to yet. Is that a school? Esme said. Was a school. They walked to it along what had been a residential street, past houses whose windows reflected the afternoon sky with an unsettling cleanliness, no broken glass, no fallen shutters. Brennan, who was the kind of person who felt uncomfortable in abandoned places but came on trips like this out of loyalty to the people he loved, had been walking with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes mostly forward, not looking too carefully at anything. He stopped outside one of the houses. Lyanna, he said. Something in his voice made everyone stop. There are pictures in there, he said. Family pictures. On the wall. They all looked through the window. There were photographs in frames on the far wall of the room beyond the glass. The kind of formal family portraits that were fashionable at the turn of the 20th century, everyone posed, expressions solemn and still. Lyanna pressed closer to the glass to look. She stepped back. Brennan, she said very carefully. How long have we been in this town? Maybe 2 hours, he said. Why? She pointed at the photographs. They looked. In the center photograph, the largest one, a family of 4 stood in what appeared to be the front room of the house, arranged with the formal stiffness of the era. Behind the family, through the window of the room in the photograph, a street was visible. On the street, 5 figures stood. The photograph was sepia, aged, worn at the edges, clearly at least a century old. But the 5 figures visible through the window in the background of the photograph were unmistakable. They were wearing the clothing of 5 people who had arrived in a truck on a September morning in the present day. One of them was holding something rectangular. Theron's drone. The silence lasted a very long time. "That's not possible," Theron said. No one agreed with him. They checked every photograph in every house on that street. They were in all of them. In every family portrait in every house on the street, if you looked in the background, through the windows, in the distances, 5 figures were visible. Sometimes close, sometimes far. Sometimes facing the camera. Sometimes turned away. But present. Present in photographs that were a century old, in a town where they had arrived 2 hours ago for the first time in their lives. In one photograph they found in the 5th house, a simple portrait of a woman sitting at a table. The background was a kitchen. Through the kitchen window, a face was visible, close to the glass, looking in. It was Esme's face. Exactly Esme's face. Young as she was now. Looking in through the kitchen window of a house in a town that had been abandoned 100 years ago. Esme looked at the photograph for a very long time. "I want to leave," she said. They left. They walked back to the truck at a pace that was not quite running but was not walking either, not talking, the town quiet around them in that specific way it had been quiet since they arrived, not the quiet of emptiness but the quiet of something that was listening. Brennan drove. He drove without stopping until they hit the logging road and then without stopping until they hit the paved highway and then for another hour before pulling into a petrol station and sitting in the truck in silence. "The photographs," Marlowe said finally. Nobody answered her. "Someone explain the photographs," she said. "Someone tell me something rational about the photographs." Nobody could. Lina wrote her thesis. She did not include Grayvale in it. She cited research difficulties and redirected to other sites. She had the drone footage and the camera shots they had taken throughout the town and she put them in a folder on an external hard drive and the folder on the hard drive in a box in the back of a storage unit. She kept the page of the ledger she had photographed. The last entry, the Thursday in November 1923. She looked at it sometimes and thought about 300 people in a functioning town and then, nothing. The page stopping. The following pages blank. What happened in November 1923 that silenced an entire settlement so completely that no one came after? No historian noted the disappearance. No survey recorded the coordinates. She had a theory. She thought about the photographs. About 5 people visible in portraits taken a century ago. About being seen before you arrive. About a place that knows you are coming before you know you are going. She thought about the school at the end of the street that they had walked toward but never reached because they had stopped at the house with the photographs and then left. She thought about what might have been in the school. She did not go back. None of them went back. But she looked at the satellite image sometimes, the rectangular clearing in the trees, the geometric shapes that didn't match natural growth, and she thought about Grayvale sitting there in the interior of British Columbia, intact, clean-windowed, listening. Waiting for the next people who would show up in its photographs before they arrived. Story 21, The Voice in the Cornfield. It started the way it always did, with the screaming. Every harvest season, when the corn grew tall enough to swallow a man whole, the people of Millhaven, a quiet farming settlement tucked into the flat open plains of rural Ohio, would hear it, a sound that had no name. It was not the cry of an animal, and it was not the wind, though every farmer who heard it tried desperately to convince themselves it was one of those two things. It rose from somewhere deep inside the cornfield, that massive, dark, rustling field that stretched for nearly 300 acres behind the old Callaway property, and it came every night without fail, from the first cold evening of harvest season, until the last stalk was cut down and hauled away. Most people kept their windows shut. Most people turned up their televisions. Most people pretended they did not hear it. But Orion Callaway, who was 14 years old that autumn, heard it every single night from his bedroom window, and unlike the adults, he could not stop listening. Orion was not the kind of boy who went looking for trouble. He was quiet and careful and thoughtful. The kind of kid who kept a journal and read books about astronomy and spent long evenings watching the stars from the roof of the old barn. His father, Grayson Callaway, had inherited the farm from his own father, and his father before that, and the Callaway family had worked that land for nearly 90 years. They knew the rhythms of it. They knew its sounds and smells and moods. But even Grayson, who was not a man easily shaken, had started locking the back door at night during harvest season. Orion noticed. He noticed the way his father's jaw went tight when the screaming started, the way his mother, Evelina, would turn on every light in the kitchen and start washing dishes even though they were already clean, the way nobody at the dinner table talked about what was happening out there in the dark. For 3 years, Orion had obeyed the unspoken rule. For 3 years, he had stayed inside. But the night of October the 14th, something changed. The screaming started at its usual time, just past 11 o'clock, when the moon was a thin white slice hanging low over the field and the corn was crackling in a breeze that smelled like cold earth and something else. Something sweet and wrong that Orion could not identify no matter how many times he tried. He lay in bed with his flashlight in his hand and his sneakers still on his feet, because some part of him had made the decision hours before his mind caught up to it. He was going in. The back door hinges did not squeak if you lifted the handle slightly while turning it. Orion had learned this 2 summers ago by accident, and he slipped out into the night without a sound. The grass was wet beneath his feet. The air hit him cold and sharp. And the screaming, out here without walls between him and it, was so much louder than it had ever seemed from his bedroom window. It was not one voice. He understood that now, standing at the edge of the field with the corn stalks looming above him, their dry leaves trembling. It was several voices, layered, overlapping, like people screaming at different distances, some close, some far, some so far away they were barely more than a thread of sound woven into the wind. Orion stood there for a long moment. He almost went back inside. Then, from somewhere deep in the corn, came a sound that was different from the rest. Not a scream. A word. He could not make it out. Not entirely, but it sounded like a name. His name. Or something close to it. A syllable that started with a sound like O and ended like something drowning. He stepped into the corn. The stalks closed around him immediately and the world shrank down to a narrow corridor of dry rustling leaves and dark packed earth and the white beam of his flashlight cutting through the shadows ahead. The smell was stronger in here. That sweet wrongness he could not name. He pushed through row after row, his flashlight swinging left and right, his heart hammering with a steady mechanical terror that he kept overriding with sheer stubbornness. He had gone maybe 200 feet into the field, losing all sense of direction in the sameness of the rows, when the screaming stopped. The silence was worse. Orion stood completely still and held his breath and listened. The corn moved in the wind but there was no other sound. No insects, no owls, no rustling of small animals in the leaves. Just that deep, hollow ringing silence that pressed against his eardrums like water. He turned his flashlight to the left, and he saw the first one. It was standing between 2 rows of corn, roughly the shape of a man, arms outstretched, head lolling to one side. A scarecrow. His father put scarecrows up every year, which was not unusual, and Orion's first thought was simply that he had not known his father had placed one this deep into the field this season. He took a step toward it out of reflex, out of the need to anchor himself to something familiar, and then the flashlight beam found its face. Orion stopped moving. The scarecrow's face was not straw. It was not burlap. It was not any of the usual materials his father used. It was skin. Stretched taut and dried to a leathery brown-gray finish, with sunken hollows where the eyes had been and a mouth pulled open in a permanent silent scream by the drying and tightening of the tissue around it. The head was attached to the crosspiece of the scarecrow frame not by nails or wire but by what looked, in the lurching white light of his flashlight, like the person's own hair, twisted and knotted around the wood. Orion made a sound he had never made before in his life. Not quite a scream. Something smaller and more broken than that. Something that barely made it past his teeth. He stepped back. He turned his flashlight to the right. There was another one. He turned it forward. There was another one. They were everywhere. Standing at irregular intervals throughout the corn, arms wide, faces slack and dried and open. Some more deteriorated than others. Some so old the faces had collapsed inward and the bodies had become skeletal shapes wrapped in the clothes they had died in, flannel shirts and denim, and one that appeared to be wearing a yellow raincoat now faded to the color of old bone. They stood silent and still in the rows of corn, and the wind moved the stalks around them, and Orion understood in one cold crashing wave of comprehension that the screaming did not come from somewhere in the corn. The screaming came from somewhere beneath it. He was standing on something hollow. He looked down. The earth beneath his feet felt different here. Softer. Disturbed. Like ground that had been turned over recently and tamped back down. He swept his flashlight across the area around him and saw it. A patch of earth roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide where the soil was darker and looser than the ground on either side of it, pressed down but not packed, with a faint depression in the center. Orion ran. He ran screaming through the corn, not caring about direction, crashing through rows and losing his flashlight somewhere in the stalks but not stopping to find it, running blind in the dark until his shoulder hit the edge of the barn and he bounced off and hit the ground and scrambled up and kept moving until he was inside the house with the door locked behind him and his back against the wall, chest heaving, both hands pressed over his mouth to hold in the sounds he was making. Grayson Calloway found his son on the kitchen floor at 2 in the morning. Orion told him everything. Grayson did not say a word during the telling. He sat at the kitchen table in his robe with his hands folded and his eyes very still, and when Orion finished talking, his father was quiet for a long time. Then Grayson said very quietly, "I know." Orion stared at him. "We all know," Grayson said. "Everyone in Millhaven knows. It's been happening since before my grandfather's time. Something lives under that field, son. Something old. And the scarecrows? We don't put those there." Orion whispered, "Then who does?" His father looked at the back door. The locked back door. The door he locked every single night during harvest season. "We don't ask that," Grayson said softly. "And we don't go into that field at night. Ever. That's the only rule." Orion looked at his father's face and saw something he had never seen there before in all 14 years of his life. He saw that his father was afraid. That was the night Orion Calloway stopped sleeping well. That was the autumn he started keeping his bedroom light on. And every harvest season for the rest of his life, even when he grew up and moved far away from Millhaven and built a life that had nothing to do with cornfields or farming, he would still wake up at exactly 11 o'clock at night, heart pounding, listening for the screaming. And some nights, lying in the dark of whatever city he was living in, he was almost certain he could still hear it. Story 22, The Midnight Train. The last train out of Kingston Station on a Friday night was supposed to depart at 11:52. Soren Blackwell caught it by the skin of his teeth, sprinting down the platform with his laptop bag bouncing against his hip and his coffee still in his hand, steam trailing behind him in the cold November air. He was a 31-year-old architect who worked too late and slept too little and lived by himself in a one-bedroom apartment on the far side of the city. And this was, unfortunately, a perfectly ordinary Friday for him. He threw himself through the doors just before they closed. The train lurched into motion. Soren found a seat in the third carriage and dropped into it heavily, pressing his back against the window and exhaling the kind of breath that contains an entire working week. The carriage was not crowded. A handful of passengers sat at intervals, a teenage boy with headphones around his neck staring at the floor, a woman in a gray coat reading something on her phone, an older man in a heavy wool suit sitting very upright with his hands on his knees, a young woman with red-painted nails holding a paper coffee cup she was not drinking from. Soren gave them all the same quick unconscious survey that a person gives their fellow train passengers, cataloging them, filing them away, returning to his own thoughts. He checked his phone. 11:54. He closed his eyes. He was not sure how long he drifted. It could not have been long. He was too tired for real sleep, the kind that actually rests you, just that gray half-aware floating that commuters know well, where you are somewhere between the train and a dream and you can still feel the vibration of the tracks beneath you. He opened his eyes. The train was still moving. He checked his phone. 12:41. Soren sat up straight. He should have been at his stop nearly 40 minutes ago. He looked out the window, but the glass was black. The train was passing through a tunnel or a section of track with no lighting on either side, and there was nothing to see but his own reflection looking back at him, pale and startled. He looked around the carriage. The same passengers were in the same seats. The teenage boy, the woman in gray, the old man, the young woman with the coffee cup. None of them had moved. Not at all. Soren pressed the call button above his seat. Nothing happened. He tried again. He stood and moved to the door at the end of the carriage to look for a conductor, but the connecting door between carriages was locked, or not locked exactly but sealed, unresponsive to any amount of pulling. He tried the one at the other end. Same result. He sat back down and tried to access the train service information on his phone, but he had no signal. Not unusual in a tunnel, but they had been in this tunnel, or dark stretch, or whatever it was, for longer than any tunnel on this route. He knew this route. He had ridden it 5 nights a week for 3 years. There were no tunnels this long. "Excuse me," he said to the woman in the gray coat. She looked up from her phone slowly. "Do you know if there's a delay? We should have arrived at Haven Cross Station 20 minutes ago at least." The woman looked at him with a gentle, patient expression. "There are no stops," she said. "Sorry?" "There are no more stops," she said. "Not on this train." Soren stared at her. That's not right. This is the 11:52. It makes 6 stops before the terminal." "It did," the old man in the wool suit said quietly without looking up. "It used to." Soren looked at him. The old man's hands, he now noticed, were resting completely still on his knees. Perfectly, unnaturally still. Not the stillness of someone being calm. The stillness of something that was not breathing. "I don't understand," Soren said. The teenage boy with the headphones took them off his neck and set them on the seat beside him very carefully. He looked at Soren with eyes that were too old for his face. "You're not supposed to be here," the boy said. "What? You shouldn't be on this train," the young woman with the red nails said. Her coffee cup was still in her hands and Soren noticed now that it was empty. Had been empty the whole time probably. "This train isn't for people like you." "People like me," Soren repeated. "Living," said the old man. The word landed in the carriage like a stone dropped into still water. Soren's blood went cold in a way he had never experienced before. Not metaphorically cold, physically cold, as though his body had just understood something that his mind was still refusing to process. "You need to get off," the woman in gray said, and there was genuine concern in her voice, the kind of concern that frightened him more than anything else she could have said. "At the next, you need to get off." "There are no stops," Soren said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There will be one," the old man said. "One more. For passengers like you." "What happened to all of you?" Soren asked. He did not fully want to know. The woman in gray looked down at her phone. The boy put his headphones back around his neck. The young woman with the red nails looked at her empty coffee cup. They did not answer. They did not need to. The answers were in the way they held themselves, in the absolute stillness of them, in the quality of their silence, which was not the silence of people who would not answer but the silence of people who no longer needed to breathe between words. The train slowed. Soren gripped the armrests. Through the black window, light appeared. Pale and distant at first, then growing, the familiar platform lighting of a station, concrete pillars and yellow marker lines and signs. The train eased to a stop. The doors opened. Soren stood. "Go," the woman in gray said. "And don't ride this train again." He stepped out onto the platform. The doors closed behind him immediately. The train pulled away. He watched it go, watched the lit windows slide past him one by one, and in each window he saw them, the other passengers, sitting in their seats perfectly still, hands folded, faces forward, going wherever they were going. He looked up at the platform sign. He was at Haven Cross, the third stop from his departure. Only 12 minutes from where he started. He checked his phone. 12:47. He stood on that empty platform for a long time before he could make himself move. When he finally rode the train home again months later, he chose a different route. He always chose a different route. He never understood how the time had passed the way it had, and he never let himself think too carefully about what the woman in gray had meant when she told him the train was not for people like him. But he never forgot the old man's word. Living. Story 23: The Red Door. The house at the end of Ash Grove Lane had three things that the realtor mentioned and one thing she did not. She mentioned the original hardwood floors, which were genuine and beautiful. She mentioned the renovated kitchen, which was spacious and well lit. She mentioned the half-acre garden, which had apple trees along the back fence that would be magnificent in spring. She did not mention the red door. Hendrix Vale noticed it on the second walkthrough. He was 38, recently separated, and buying the house alone, which was not how he had imagined this chapter of his life going. But the house was big enough for his daughter Juniper when she stayed on weekends, and the price was within his range, and there was something about the place that felt, despite everything, like starting over rather than giving up. The red door was at the end of the upstairs hallway, past the main bathroom and the smaller of the two spare bedrooms. It was painted a deep, dark red, not quite the red of a stop sign or a fire truck, more the color of dried blood, which Hendrix only thought later and wished he hadn't. At first he assumed it was an aesthetic choice by a previous owner, someone with strong opinions about interior design. But when he reached for the handle, the realtor, Delphine Marsh, was at his elbow very quickly. "That room is sealed," she said brightly. "Sealed? Previous owners had it closed off. We're selling as is. It doesn't affect the listed square footage, it's been accounted for." She was already moving back toward the stairs with the smooth efficiency of someone changing the subject. "Shall we look at the garden?" Hendrix looked at the door for a moment longer. Then he followed her. He bought the house. He moved in on a gray Saturday in February with the help of two friends and a rented van, and by evening he was alone in the place with his furniture arranged well enough and a takeaway container on the coffee table and the television on. The house felt large and quiet in a way he would eventually get used to. He thought about Juniper's first weekend visit and what he would cook for her and whether the smaller bedroom got enough morning light. He did not hear the knocking that first night. Or if he did, he was too tired and too deep in the heaviness of the move to register it consciously. The second night he heard it. It was past midnight. He was lying in bed not quite asleep when the sound began. 3 slow knocks, evenly spaced, heavy. Like a fist rather than a knuckle. He lay there and listened and told himself it was the pipes. Old houses had noisy pipes. He had been told this by everyone he knew who had ever bought an old house. The knocking came again. 3 knocks. Slower this time. As if whatever was making the sound had all the time in the world. Hendricks sat up. He was a rational man who believed in rational explanations, and he sat in his bed running through the list of them. Pipes. The house settling. A bird or squirrel that had somehow gotten into the walls. The wind against something loose in the eaves. 3 knocks. He got up and went into the hallway and stood outside the red door and listened. Silence. He went back to bed. The third night it happened again, beginning at the same time, that particular dead hour past midnight when the house was at its quietest. 3 knocks. Then a pause. Then 3 knocks again. Hendricks counted the pauses and found they were not random. They were exactly 45 seconds apart, with a precision that no pipe, no animal, no settling of wood and plaster could account for. By the end of the first week, he had developed a habit of sleeping with his bedroom door closed and a pillow over his head. It did not help, because the sound grew. Not louder at first, just more frequent. The pattern of 3 knocked twice now, then 3 times, then what seemed like a continuous rolling of impact against the inside of that door that rattled the framed print on the hallway wall outside it. Hendricks pressed his ear to the door once, which he immediately regretted, because through the wood he could hear not just the knocking but something underneath it. Something low and rhythmic, like breathing. He called a contractor. The contractor, a phlegmatic man named Burns who had clearly heard everything in 30 years of working on old houses, came and assessed the door and confirmed it was nailed shut, not simply locked, with long heavy nails driven through the frame at intervals. He offered to open it. Hendricks said he would think about it. He should have said yes immediately. Instead he went away for a weekend to visit his brother in Portland, and when he came back the house was cold and quiet and the hallway looked entirely normal, and he almost convinced himself he had been catastrophizing. He took the pillow off the head muffling stack on his bed. He left his bedroom door open. 3 weeks later, Juniper came to stay. She was 8 years old and she had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubbornness, and she had never once in her life been afraid of the dark. But on her first morning at the house, she came to the kitchen table and sat down for breakfast and said, very matter-of-factly, as though she was reporting a fact about the weather, "Dad, there's something behind the red door." Hendricks went very still. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "I heard it last night," Juniper said, reaching for the cereal box. "It was knocking. And then it stopped and I heard it talking." Every hair on Hendricks's body stood at attention. "Talking?" he said carefully. She poured her cereal. "I couldn't hear what it said. It was too quiet through the door. But it was definitely talking." She looked up at him. "Who lives in that room, Dad?" Hendricks called the contractor that afternoon. Burns came the next day and looked at the door and started pulling nails. He had 4 of the 7 out before he stopped. He stopped because the nails, which had been driven straight and clean when he arrived, had bent. Not pulled loose from the frame. Not worked out by the wood shifting. But as if something on the other side had taken them in its hands and curved them away from the wood with slow, deliberate force. Burns stepped back from the door. "I'm going to need to think about whether I want to finish this job," he said. "Get out of the house," Hendricks said. They both did. Hendricks stood on the front path in the cold February air and looked up at the window of the room behind the red door, which faced the front of the house, and he thought he saw something in the glass. Not a face. Not exactly. But a shape. A shadow pressed close to the glass from inside. He called the realtor. Delphine Marsh did not answer. He called the previous owners, whose name he had found on old mail still being delivered to the address. An elderly woman answered on the 3rd ring. When Hendricks explained who he was and where he was calling from, she went completely silent for such a long time that he thought the call had dropped. Then she said, "Did you open the door?" "No," Hendricks said. Another silence. "Don't," she said. And then, "Sell the house. Go somewhere else. I'm sorry. I know we should have told someone. We were too afraid to tell someone." "Tell them what?" Hendricks demanded. "What's in that room?" But the elderly woman had already hung up. Hendricks Vale sold the house 6 weeks later at a loss. He moved into an apartment with no hallways longer than 10 feet and no doors he did not have a clear history for. He never found out what was behind the red door. He was not sure by the end that he wanted to. But some nights in the apartment he would wake up at the same dead hour of the night and lie there listening to the silence. And in the silence he would hear or imagine he heard that same sound. 3 knocks. Patient. Even. Absolutely certain that eventually, someone would open the door. Story 24, The Missing 911 Call. The night shift at Westfield Emergency Dispatch was never entirely quiet. There was always something: a fender bender on the interstate, a domestic dispute on one of the residential streets, a teenager who had drunk too much and panicked, a dog that had not come home. Talia Remington had worked the night shift for 11 years and she knew its rhythms the way a musician knows a song. The lulls and the surges, the calls that were genuinely urgent and the ones that were not, the particular quality of fear in a voice that meant something was really wrong versus the quality that meant someone was frightened but safe. She prided herself on that. The ability to read a voice. The call came in at 2:17 in the morning on a Wednesday in March. 911, what is your emergency? The voice on the other end was female. Young. A teenager or perhaps early 20s. And the fear in it was immediate and absolute. The real kind, the kind that made the back of Talia's neck go cold before the words even registered. Please, the voice breathed. Please, someone's in my house. Please. Okay, Talia said, her voice dropping into the particular smooth calm of someone trained to be the steadiest thing in a terrified person's world. I hear you. You're safe, I'm right here. Can you tell me your address? The girl gave an address. Talia began typing it. Her fingers slowed. I need you to stay on the line with me, Talia said. Are you somewhere safe in the house right now? I'm in the closet, the girl whispered. In my bedroom. I locked the door but I can hear him. I can hear him moving around downstairs. Okay, you're doing great. Help is on the way. Talia was dispatching a unit simultaneously, her eyes on her screen. Can you tell me your name? Pause. Rosalie, the girl whispered. Talia's fingers stopped moving. She stared at her screen. The address the girl had given was on Brackmore Street. Talia knew that address. She knew it with a sudden and total physical certainty that hit her like stepping off a curb she had not seen. She knew the shape of the house in her mind without trying to. The white clapboard siding and the blue mailbox and the particular slant of the front porch and the bedroom at the top of the stairs with the closet that had a door that did not latch properly unless you lifted the handle. That was her childhood home. She had grown up in that house. Her family had moved away when she was 17. She had not been back in 14 years. Rosalie, Talia said carefully, keeping her voice absolutely even. Are you alone in the house? No. I mean, yes. I'm alone, I don't know where my parents are, they went out and they're not back yet. Rosalie, how old are you? A hesitation. 16. Talia looked at the dispatch record on her screen. She looked at the timestamp of the call. She looked at the address again and the address was right and it was real and it was generating a live incident number. Her sister's name had been Rosalie. Her sister had been 16 years old when she vanished from that house on a Wednesday night in March 20 years ago. Her parents had gone out for the evening and come home to find Rosalie gone. The closet door in the bedroom at the top of the stairs had been open. One of Rosalie's shoes had been found on the back porch. She had never been found. Talia was breathing but she could not feel herself breathing. Rosalie, she said. I need to ask you something important and I need you to stay very calm. When did your parents go out tonight? Around 8, the girl whispered. Rosalie, what year is it? She had not meant to ask that. She was trained never to ask irrelevant questions during an active emergency. But the words came out before she could stop them. Silence on the line. What? The girl whispered. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked that. Units are on their way, you're going to be okay. Can you hear him still? Is he still moving around downstairs? Yes, the girl breathed. And then, barely audible, he's on the stairs. Rosalie, listen to me. Push yourself as far back in that closet as you can go and do not make any noise. The officers are very close. The door, the girl whispered. The door isn't latching. I have to hold the handle. If I let go it will open. Hold the handle. Don't let go. I'm right here. A sound on the line. A creak of floorboards. He's right outside, the girl breathed so quietly Talia could barely hear it. He's right outside the door. Units are 30 seconds out, Talia said because they were. She could hear them on the radio. She could see their position on her screen. Hold the handle. Don't let go. A long silence. And then the line went dead. Talia sat at her desk with the headset still on, staring at the screen where the call had been, which now showed only the closed incident record. The units reported arriving at the address 40 seconds after the call dropped. They searched the house. They found no one. No teenager hiding in a closet. No intruder. No sign of a disturbance. But the responding officer noted in his report that the door to the bedroom closet at the top of the stairs was standing open. And on the floor of the closet, visible in the beam of his flashlight, was a single child's shoe. Talia submitted her report and went home at the end of her shift and sat in her car in the parking garage for 23 minutes before she could drive. She never spoke about the call to her colleagues. She had it removed from her active file on a technicality she asked a sympathetic supervisor to arrange. She spent the next month trying to rationalize it. A coincidence of address. A girl with a common name. A situation that resembled, in broad strokes, what had happened to her sister. Because those situations happened because intruders broke into houses with girls home alone, because the world was full of awful repetitions. But she could not rationalize the shoe. And she could not rationalize the thing she had noticed in the incident record when she reviewed it 2 days later. The thing she had been too shaken to catch in the moment. The timestamp on the call was correct. 2:17 in the morning, the current year, the current date. But the incident number generated by the call was from a format Westfield Dispatch had not used since it upgraded its system. 14 years ago. Story 25, The Cave Recording. The four of them had been planning the Ardmore Cave expedition for the better part of a year. Atlas Farron was the experienced one, 34 years old, a geological survey consultant who had been caving since he was 19 and who had mapped several previously uncharted systems in the limestone hills of rural Wales. He was the one who had found the reference to Ardmore in an obscure 19th century naturalist journal and had spent 6 months acquiring the permits and equipment for a proper survey. Killian Shaw was the photographer. Xavier Moss was the geologist, 28 and brilliant and slightly claustrophobic, which he had disclosed to the team and which he assured them was fine, totally manageable. Scarlett Voss was the documentary filmmaker who had approached Atlas through a mutual contact with an offer to fund part of the expedition in exchange for filming rights. They entered Ardmore Cave on a gray Tuesday morning in mid-October. The cave system was not especially dangerous by the standards of serious caving, no siphons, no technically demanding vertical sections, primarily horizontal passage with some awkward squeezes in the deeper sections. Atlas had reviewed the historical survey maps with Scarlett the night before in their rented cottage, and the system appeared to extend roughly 300 meters into the hillside before the passage narrowed to a point where the 19th century explorer had turned back. What the 19th century explorer had not mentioned was the sound. Atlas heard it first about 90 meters in when they stopped to take measurements. He had his audio recorder running as he always did in cave surveys, useful for dictating notes in situations where writing was inconvenient. And he noticed a sound in the passage that was beneath the range of easy hearing, almost infrasound. A low, cycling exhalation that seemed to come from somewhere ahead, from tunnels branching off the main passage to the left and right where the cave system fractured into narrower channels too small for a person to navigate. He mentioned it to Killian. "Wind through the passage," Killian said and took a photograph. "Maybe," Atlas said. They pressed on. At the 150-meter mark, Xavier's claustrophobia began to reassert itself in a way he had clearly not anticipated. The passage had narrowed significantly and required them to move in single file with their packs held out in front of them, and the weight of the rock above was all too visible in the beam of their headlamps, an enormous, indifferent massiveness pressing down from above. Xavier stopped moving and pressed his back against the wall and breathed carefully, and Scarlett talked to him in a low, steady voice until he was ready to continue. While they waited, Atlas listened. The breathing sound was closer now. Not from both sides anymore. From the left. From a passage roughly 30 centimeters wide that angled sharply down into darkness. No person could fit into that passage. Something could breathe in it, though. Or something that generated the sound of breathing could come from it. Atlas pointed his audio recorder toward the passage and let it run. They moved on. An hour later, at the point where the cave system bent back toward the surface in a long upward squeeze, they heard something that was not infrasound and was not ambiguous. A voice. Not ahead. Not behind. From the small passages. From the network of narrow channels in the rock that threaded through the cave system like capillaries, too small for anything human to enter, too dark and deep to see into even with a direct light. The voice spoke once. Then again. Then the sound changed and Atlas understood, with the focused horror of a man who had spent 15 years in caves and trusted them completely, that it was not one voice. It was four. 4 voices, overlapping, coming from the tunnels too small for a human body, speaking clearly enough to be recognized as speech but not clearly enough to make out the words. "We're leaving," Atlas said. No one argued. They got out in 40 minutes, faster than they'd come in. Xavier scraped his arm on a narrow section but didn't stop. Scarlett left a tripod somewhere around the 100-meter mark and didn't go back for it. They came out into the gray October daylight and stood at the mouth of the cave, and none of them said anything for a long time. Atlas reviewed his audio recording that evening at the cottage. The recording was 3 hours and 40 minutes long. He listened through it from the beginning, cataloging the ambient sounds of the cave survey, the scrape of equipment, the measured voices of his team, the water sounds in the deeper sections. At the 2-hour and 12-minute mark, he heard the voices from the narrow tunnels. Exactly as he remembered them. 4 voices, overlapping, intelligible as speech but not quite transcribable. He turned the volume up and slowed the playback. He could make out the voices better now. They were speaking names. 4 names. His name. Killian's name. Xavier's name. Scarlett's name. Repeated, one after another, in a slow rolling cycle. Atlas checked the timestamp on his recorder and compared it against the notes he had made throughout the survey. The voices on the recording were speaking their names 2 hours and 12 minutes into the cave. They had not entered Ardmore Cave until 2 hours and 40 minutes after he had started the recording. The voices had been saying their names for 28 minutes before Atlas and his team had even walked through the entrance. Atlas sat with that information for a long time. He never published the survey. He never returned to Ardmore Cave. He deleted the audio file once and retrieved it from his trash folder twice before finally making a copy on a drive he kept in a box in his storage unit, the same box where he kept the notes and the maps and the 19th century journal that had started everything. He told no one about the voices for 4 years. When he finally told Scarlett, over dinner in a restaurant somewhere bright and loud and full of people. She was quiet for a moment and then she opened her phone and played him something. Her own recording. Running the whole time for the documentary. She had found the same anomaly. 28 minutes before they entered. The same 4 voices. The same names. She had not told him either. They paid the bill and walked out into the evening and didn't talk about it again. But neither of them ever went caving again. Story 26, The Sleep Experiment. The advertisement was straightforward and even a little boring in its directness. Paid sleep study. 7 days. Residential. Participants required to remain awake for duration. Compensation, $4,000. Draven Cole found it on a bulletin board in the lobby of his apartment building and stared at it for a long moment. He was 27 years old and between jobs and $4,000 was more than he currently had in his checking account by a factor of several. He had always maintained, an excellent insomniac. A person who had never really slept well and who therefore did not have far to fall from ordinary waking life to the enforced wakefulness the study required. He called the number. 3 weeks later he arrived at the Rayford Institute, a low, nondescript building on the outskirts of Montreal that looked more like a corporate office than a research facility. He was shown to a room. A reasonably comfortable room with a single bed, a desk, a television, and no windows. The bed was there to sit on. The television was there to help pass time. A staff member explained the schedule with the brisk cheerfulness of someone explaining airline safety procedures. Participants would be monitored at all times by camera, they could move freely within the residential wing, meals would be provided 3 times daily, medical checks every 12 hours, and under no circumstances were they to sleep. There were 6 participants. Draven. A 30-year-old teacher named Atlas who had done something similar before and seemed entirely unworried. A quiet woman named Vienna who knitted obsessively and barely spoke. A large affable man in his 40s who introduced himself as Hendrix's brother, which no one found clarifying, and who went by the name Ford. A younger woman, maybe 22, with long braided hair who gave her name as Amaris. And an older man, perhaps 60, who wore a cardigan and spoke with a faint Scottish accent and who Draven only ever knew as Dr. Ellsworth, which may or may not have been his actual name. The first 2 days were manageable. Uncomfortable but manageable. The body has remarkable reserves when it knows sleep deprivation is the point of the exercise. When you are being paid to endure it and there is structure around you and other people sharing the condition. They watched movies together in the common room. They played cards. Amaris taught Draven 3 separate card tricks that he could not master and she could not stop laughing at his failures, which made the hours pass. Day 3 was harder. The edges of things began to soften. Colors flattened slightly. Draven found himself reading the same paragraph in a book 3 times and retaining nothing. He developed a headache that sat behind his eyes and did not move. Dr. Ellsworth stopped talking much. Ford fell asleep for 11 minutes in a chair and was woken by a staff member who appeared from nowhere with a gentle but completely non-negotiable touch on the shoulder. Day 4 was the beginning of the strange. Vienna, who had been knitting steadily and speaking little, stopped knitting. She put her needles down on the table in the common room and stared at the corner of the room for 40 minutes without moving. When Draven asked if she was all right, she said, "There's someone standing there." The corner was empty. "Where?" Draven asked. "There," she said. He looked very carefully. He stood up and walked to the corner, and there was no one there, no shadow, no anomaly in the light. He told her this. They moved when you got up, Vienna said without looking at him. Day 5. The medical staff noted elevated cortisol in everyone. Dr. Ellsworth ate almost nothing at dinner and sat at the table with his hands flat on the surface and his eyes moving very slowly around the room, tracking something. Draven watched him do it and could not tell if the older man was following an actual movement or if his eyes were simply sliding, unfocused, through the sheer weight of sleeplessness. Then Draven saw it himself. He was sitting in his room watching television with the sound low when he became aware, in the particular diffuse way of extreme exhaustion, of a shape in the corner to his left. Not a person. Not exactly. A vertical dark mass that was not quite the shadow the lamp would naturally throw, and that was, if he looked at it with his full attention, not quite there. But if he let his eyes unfocus, if he stopped forcing himself to see clearly the way you stop forcing a word to make sense if you stare at it long enough, it was absolutely there, standing in the corner, watching him. He turned the lamp to face the corner directly. The shape resolved into nothing. He turned back to the television. In his peripheral vision, the shape was there again within minutes. Amaris knocked on his door at 2 a.m. "Are you seeing things?" she asked. She looked terrible. They all looked terrible by this point, gray and hollow-eyed, but Amaris had a specific expression of controlled fear that Draven recognized because he felt it himself. "Yes," he said. "In the corners?" "Yes." "Mind speaks," she said. Draven stared at her. "Whispers," she corrected. "I can't hear what it's saying. But it's definitely saying something. It's been doing it for 6 hours." They sat together in the common room until morning. Draven watched the corners. The shapes were there, plural now, more than one corner, more than one room. He could not hear them speaking, but he believed Amaris absolutely, because there was something about the way they existed in the peripheral vision that was not random and was not the noise of an exhausted mind and was entirely too specific to be hallucination. He had a theory about hallucination. Hallucinations were random. They were the mind-generating signal from static. But these shapes were consistent, in the same places at the same distances, behaving in the same ways across multiple people who were not comparing notes. That was not static. On the morning of day 6, Dr. Ellsworth withdrew from the study. He came to the common room before breakfast and stood in the doorway and said very calmly that he was done. The staff member on duty asked if he wanted to discuss his reasons. "No," Dr. Ellsworth said. "I don't think I do." He was gone within the hour. On day 6, Draven's shape spoke to him. He was in the bathroom, standing at the sink, running cold water over his wrist the way the medical staff recommended for staying alert, and he looked up at his reflection in the mirror, and the shape was behind him in the reflection. Not behind him in the room. He checked, he turned and looked, and nothing was there. Only in the mirror. And in the mirror, it leaned close to his ear, its shape bending toward him with a terrible slow patience, and it said something. He could not make out the words. He told himself later that he could not make out the words. He maintained this position with complete consistency for the rest of his life. He left the study that afternoon. He forfeited the $4,000. Vienna left 2 hours later. Amaris left the following morning, which technically completed 6 of the 7 days and earned her most of her payment. Ford completed the study. He never said what he experienced on day 7, and he rebuffed every question about it with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Draven spent the next 3 months sleeping with the lights on. The shapes in the corners faded quickly once the sleep deprivation resolved. But something else stayed with him. Something he found impossible to explain without sounding delusional. A sense, in certain rooms, in certain lights, that the corners were not quite empty. That something had learned where to stand. And had learned to be patient enough not to speak. Story 27, The House on Black Creek Road. The bet started the way terrible ideas always do. With boredom and boys and someone saying, "I dare you." It was Killian who found it, technically. He had been driving the back roads outside Copper Falls, New Hampshire on a slow August afternoon and spotted the ruins of the farmhouse set back from Black Creek Road, half the roof caved in, the porch rotted through, the windows black and empty, the whole structure sagging on its foundation like a man who had given up standing. He drove past it 3 times before he turned around. The property had a history, as properties like this always do. Killian went home and did the research in the way young men do when they suspect they are about to do something inadvisable and want to feel prepared rather than deterred. The house had belonged to the Varick family, farmed the surrounding land for decades. The fire that destroyed most of the upper story had occurred, by various accounts, somewhere between 18 and 20 years ago, and no official cause was ever confirmed. The Varick family had not lived there since. The property had been for sale for years and no buyer had ever stayed interested. Killian presented this information to his 3 closest friends as though it were a sales pitch. Draven said absolutely not. Soren said he was in. Xavier, who should have had more sense, also said he was in. Draven changed his mind 40 minutes later, which he would regret for the rest of his life. They arrived at the house at 11 o'clock on a Friday night with 4 sleeping bags, 4 flashlights, a portable speaker, and enough snacks to survive a weekend rather than a single night, which was either optimism or the specific over-preparation of people who are secretly afraid. The house was worse up close than it had looked from the road. The porch gave dangerously under their weight and Killian put his foot through a board before they were halfway across it. The front door was not locked. It was simply there, hanging slightly open, and when Killian pushed it the hinges screamed in a way that made all 4 of them flinch and then laugh, the kind of laugh that is mostly nerves. Inside was dark and damp and smelled of old smoke and something else. Something organic and green, the smell of water that had gotten into the walls and stayed there for years, rotting everything slowly from within. The floor of the front room was salvageable. The back of the house, where the fire had been worst, was less so. The floor in the kitchen had partially collapsed and the ceiling above it was open to the sky, or rather to the remnants of the upper story above the kitchen, a precarious tangle of charred timbers and fallen plaster. They stayed in the front room. They laid out their sleeping bags in a loose circle and ate chips and played music and told each other how stupid this was, which is how you survive doing stupid things, by maintaining a running commentary of your own ridiculousness. Draven kept his flashlight on his lap and kept the beam pointed at the doorways. Soren explored the house further than the others and came back with a description of the upstairs landing that made them all glad the staircase was too damaged to climb safely. At midnight, Xavier said, "Do you smell that?" They all did. Food. Hot food. Specifically and unmistakably the smell of something cooked on a stove, warm and savory and entirely out of place in a burned-out ruin. Draven identified it first as something stewed, meat and vegetables, the kind of food that requires hours of preparation. "It's coming from the back," Killian said. "Don't," Draven said. Killian went anyway. He went with his flashlight and his characteristic inability to leave something uninvestigated, and Soren went after him because Soren could not let Killian do anything alone. And then there were only 2 of them in the front room and Draven looked at Xavier and Xavier looked at Draven and they both got up and followed. The smell was stronger in the kitchen doorway. Stronger and impossible because the kitchen was open to the collapsed ceiling and the cold August night above it, and no amount of wind could carry a smell like this from outside, and there was no stove operating in this ruin, there was no electricity in this ruin, there was nothing in this ruin that could produce. There was a table. A kitchen table in the section of the kitchen floor that had not collapsed, pushed against the wall, and on the table were dishes. Not remnants. Not ancient, rusted, decayed dishes. Dishes that looked recent. A bowl of something steaming, still steaming, condensation rising from it in the cold air. A plate with bread. A jug of something. Set for a meal. The 4 of them stood in the kitchen doorway and stared at it. "This isn't from tonight," Soren said, with a certainty that sounded like he was trying to convince himself. "It's steaming," Killian said. "Something could cause steam that isn't heat. That's not how steam works." Draven was not paying attention to the dishes anymore. He was paying attention to the sounds coming from under the floor. Below the collapsed section of the kitchen, below the rotted floorboards and the debris, somewhere beneath the house itself, he could hear voices. Quiet. Domestic. The kind of voices that come from a household in its ordinary rhythms. Someone asking a question, someone answering, the particular low murmur of people who live together and know each other's cadences completely. The family talking. In the dark beneath a burned-out house. Nobody said anything for a very long time. Then Killian said, "I think we should leave." This was the most sensible thing Killian had said all evening and they acted on it with impressive speed, through the front room and across the ruined porch and down the path to the road and into the car in under 2 minutes. And Soren drove and nobody spoke for 15 minutes until they reached the lights of Copper Falls and only then did anyone breathe normally. They never went back. But Xavier, the geologist, spent several months afterward trying to find an explanation that satisfied him. Old gas lines generating heat. Some property of the burned structure that created acoustic effects simulating voices. He built an elaborate theory and took notes, and then one evening looking at his notes he stopped. Because what he could not explain was the food. He could not explain how steam rises from something cold. And he could not explain who had set the table. Story 28, The Doll Collection. Lucien Hargrove was not the kind of person who got nervous about babysitting. He was 23 years old, studying psychology at the university, and had been babysitting since he was 16 for various families in his neighborhood in Brighton, England. He liked kids. He was good with them. He had a patience for the particular logic of children's minds that many adults found baffling or exhausting but that Lucien found genuinely interesting. The Westcott family was referred to him through a mutual acquaintance. Dr. Westcott and his wife were going to a dinner engagement and needed someone for their daughter, Indigo, who was 7 years old and reportedly very well behaved but a bit unusual. Lucien thought nothing of this. All children were a bit unusual. That was what made them interesting. He arrived at the Westcott house at 6 in the evening. Dr. Westcott answered the door, a tall, thin man with the distracted manner of someone who lived primarily in his own head. He introduced Lucien to Indigo, who was standing in the hallway with her hands folded and who regarded Lucien with a direct, assessing intelligence that was slightly startling in a 7-year-old. She had dark eyes and dark hair cut in a straight fringe, and she shook Lucien's hand with great seriousness when introduced. "Indigo will show you around," Dr. Westcott said. "She knows the rules. Dinner is in the fridge. Bedtime is 8:30. He paused. "If she asks you to go into her room and look at her dolls, you don't have to." Lucien thought that was a strange thing to say. He did not ask about it. The evening went well. Indigo was indeed well behaved, though she spoke rarely and in the way of someone who had decided that words were valuable resources not to be wasted. She ate her dinner without complaint. She watched half an hour of a nature documentary about deep ocean creatures. She asked Lucien 2 questions: whether he thought fish dreamed, and whether he believed that people could leave parts of themselves behind when they went away. Lucien answered both questions carefully, and Indigo nodded at his answers with the judicious approval of someone scoring a test. At 7:45, Indigo said, "Would you like to see my dolls?" Lucien remembered Dr. Westcott's comment. "Sure," he said, because he was curious and because refusing a child's invitation to see their toys seemed unkind. Indigo's room was at the top of the stairs. It was a neat, well-ordered room with bookshelves and a small desk and a white wardrobe, and 3 entire walls lined with shelves of dolls. Not a collection in the ordinary sense of the word. Not a scatter of favored toys. A systematic, organized, comprehensive display, hundreds of dolls of every kind and era, arranged in careful rows from floor to ceiling. Lucien stood in the doorway and looked at them. And then he began to look at them more carefully. The dolls were unusual. Not in an artistic sense. In a specific, troubling sense that he could not immediately identify but that made the skin on his arms prickle. He stepped into the room and looked at the nearest shelf. The dolls had real hair. Not the synthetic fiber of commercially produced dolls. Human hair. He could see it in the texture, in the variation of color along individual strands, in the way it moved, in the slight translucency of it in the lamplight. Human hair, attached to the dolls' heads in ways that were careful and deliberate and preserved. "Indigo," Lucien said, keeping his voice calm. "These dolls, where does the hair come from?" Indigo was sitting on her bed watching him with those assessing dark eyes. "Each one is different," she said. "What do you mean?" "Each doll was made after someone," Indigo said. "After someone went away from our town. Someone who was here and then wasn't." Lucien's throat was dry. "Who makes them?" he asked. "My father," Indigo said simply. Lucien looked back at the shelves. He counted the dolls on the nearest shelf. 12. He looked at the shelf above. 12 more. He looked around the room at the hundreds and hundreds of them, and he thought about the phrase "someone who went away from our town." Someone who was here and then wasn't. "They're not all from our town," Indigo added helpfully. "Some are from further away. But most are from here." Lucien looked at her. "And the hair." "People leave things behind," Indigo said. "My father says everyone who goes away leaves something. He collects the things. He keeps them safe." She tilted her head. "He says it's important to remember people who go away. That's why he makes the dolls. So we remember them." Lucien took out his phone. His hands, he noticed distantly, were not entirely steady. "Indigo, I need to make a phone call. I'll be just outside the door." "Okay," Indigo said. He stepped into the hallway and stood with the door open and his back against the wall and his heart hammering with the particular cold rhythm of someone who is realizing something gradually and does not want to arrive at the conclusion they are approaching. He searched the Westcott family name alongside Brighton and missing persons. He found 3 results in the first 2 pages of results. He found a 4th on the 3rd page. He found a 5th. He put his phone away and called the Westcott's number to tell them he was unwell and had to leave and could they come home. And Dr. Westcott answered and said they would be back shortly in a very calm voice, the kind of calm that now struck Lucien as not the calm of a distracted academic but the calm of someone who was very used to being calm under particular circumstances. Lucien went downstairs and waited at the front door. Indigo came to the top of the stairs. "You don't have to go," she said. "I think I do," Lucien said. Indigo looked at him. "My father says people who visit and don't stay, leave things behind too." She said it without any apparent intent to threaten. She said it the way she said everything, with the careful factual delivery of someone reporting known information. "He says everyone leaves something." Lucien left. He reported what he had seen to the police the following morning. The investigation took several weeks. Dr. Westcott was ultimately arrested in connection with the disappearance of a man from the neighboring village, the first of eventually several connections made between the family and missing persons cases in the surrounding region. Lucien was asked many times over the subsequent months what had frightened him most. The discovery in the room, the father's behavior, the investigation that followed. He always said it was Indigo. Not her complicity or her knowledge, though those were terrible. What stayed with him was the simple way she had spoken about the dolls. The absence of any understanding that what she was describing was wrong. As if it had always been normal. As if it was simply what her father did, because someone had to remember the people who went away. Story 29, The Cave Under My House. Grayson Merritt bought the house on Sallow Street after his divorce and intended to renovate it from the basement up. He was 41 years old, a contractor by profession, which meant he had both the skills and the overconfidence that comes from knowing exactly how much work a project involves and deciding to do it anyway. The house was a Victorian terrace in the outer suburbs of Edinburgh, solid bones, good brickwork, terrible kitchen, and a basement that the surveyor had described as functional but unfinished, and which turned out to mean a low-ceilinged concrete-floored space that smelled of old damp and appeared to have been used primarily for storage by every previous occupant for roughly a century. Grayson started in the basement because that was where the damp was coming from. He spent the first weekend clearing it out. Boxes of other people's abandoned objects. Old furniture, forgotten tools, the accumulated sediment of previous lives. By Sunday afternoon the basement was empty and clean and he could see the walls and floor clearly for the first time. That was when he noticed the section of floor in the far corner. It was a patch roughly 4 feet by 4 feet where the concrete was newer than the surrounding floor. Visibly so, a different color and texture laid at a different time. Grayson knew what this meant. At some point in the past someone had dug into the floor and then filled it back in. Common enough. Could have been for a drainage pipe, a sump pump, any number of practical reasons. He got his tools. The newer concrete was thinner than he expected and came up in large pieces. Beneath it was soil. Beneath the soil, about 18 inches down, was a wooden cover, heavy planks, thick and old, fixed to a simple frame. Grayson pulled it up. A tunnel opened below him, wide enough to enter on hands and knees, lined with old brick, descending at a shallow angle into the dark beneath the house. Grayson shone his torch down it. The tunnel went further than his light reached. He told himself, standing over it with his torch in his hand, that this was not unusual. Edinburgh had a well-documented history of underground passages, cellars connected by tunnels, the famous Edinburgh vaults, old infrastructure of every kind beneath the modern city. There were entire walking tours dedicated to the underground city. This tunnel was probably connected to some long-disused drainage or service passage. He lowered himself into it. The brick was old and slightly damp. The floor was packed earth. The ceiling was low enough that he had to move in a crouch. The tunnel ran straight for perhaps 15 meters and then curved gently to the right. Grayson followed it. On the walls, beginning about 10 meters in, were scratches. He stopped. He put his torch close to the wall and looked. They were not random scratches. Not the scraping of tools or the marks of construction work. They were deliberate, carved into the brick with something narrow and hard, with real force, some of them deep enough that the brick had crumbled slightly around the edges. Letters. Names. Grayson read the first one. He read the second. He read the third and stopped moving. The names were familiar. Not to him personally. He had lived on Sallow Street for 3 months and did not know the neighborhood well. But he recognized the format of the name beside the third one. A date, roughly 8 months ago, written in the same narrow scratch script. And beside it, carved deeper and with more force than the others, 2 words. Still here. Grayson went back up the tunnel and called the police. The investigation that followed revealed the tunnel extended over 60 meters, curving under several properties on Sallow Street and connecting to a natural cavity in the ground, an underground space roughly the size of a large room, with an earthen floor and brick-lined walls and a ceiling of solid rock. The cavity had been used. That was the word the investigators used, which covered a great deal and explained nothing. The names on the tunnel walls were cross-referenced against missing persons reports. The police did not release how many matches they found. They released a statement describing the discovery of an underground space of historical significance, which required further investigation. Grayson Merritt sold the house within 2 months at a significant loss. He was fortunate in finding a buyer who had not heard about the investigation. What the investigators did not release, but what Grayson knew because a detective had told him in an unguarded moment, was that the names on the walls went back years, decades. The scratches were not all the same age. They had been added to over a long period of time. The same handwriting throughout. The same handwriting. Over decades. In a tunnel sealed beneath a concrete floor that had been poured over 30 years ago. And the name dated 8 months ago, 8 months before Grayson ever set foot in that house, was the name of a person who had been reported missing from Sallow Street 6 months before Grayson purchased it, whose case was still open, whose body was never found, whose name was the only one on the walls with the date written beside it, and the words, "Still here." Story 30, The Shadow Behind the Door. Atlas Vane was 9 years old and did not believe in monsters. He was a logical child, or as logical as a 9-year-old can be, the kind who asked for explanations and wanted them to make sense, who read books above his grade level and who had already concluded, through a careful process of reasoning, that the things people feared in the dark were simply the things of the ordinary world made unrecognizable by shadow and imagination. He was not afraid of the dark. He was not afraid of noises in the house at night. He was not afraid of the face his closet door made when it was half open and the street light hit it at a particular angle. But on the night of the 3rd of November, Atlas Vane began to be afraid of his bedroom door. It started with the shadow. He was reading in bed past his assigned lights out, which was technically against the rules but which his parents had never enforced with much rigor. The hallway light was on, throwing a strip of yellow under his bedroom door. He had looked at that strip of light approximately 10,000 times in his life. It was familiar and reassuring, proof that the house was awake and his parents were still up. He looked at it on the night of the 3rd of November and saw a shadow, a shape in the light under the door. Not the quick flicker of someone walking past. Not his mother on the way to the bathroom. A static shape, 2 columns of darkness roughly where feet and legs would be if someone were standing just outside his door. Atlas looked at it for a moment. He called, "Mom?" Nothing. "Dad?" Nothing. The shadow did not move. He thought about getting up to open the door. He thought about it for a full minute and then decided against it for reasons he could not entirely articulate. Some instinct that predated logic, something the logical part of his mind tried to override and failed. He turned off his light and went to sleep. The next night the shadow was there again. And the night after. By the end of the first week, Atlas had told his parents about it. His father, Hendrix Vane, went and stood in the hallway while Atlas watched from under the door, and his father's shadow looked entirely different from the one that appeared at night. Different height, different angle, different quality. "There's no one there, mate," his father said from right outside the door. "I know," Atlas said. "Could be the neighbor's cat. Could be the hedge moving in the wind outside the front window. Light does interesting things at night." "I know," Atlas said. His father was not wrong about any of that. Atlas knew it. He applied his logic to it and found reasonable explanations and went to bed satisfied. The shadow appeared at 11:37. Atlas knew the time because he had stayed awake on purpose and watched the clock. It was different tonight. The shape was lower, as if whatever was making it had crouched. Or was shorter. Child height. And it was closer to the door. The shadow was sharper, the way shadows get when the thing casting them is right up against the light source rather than further away. Atlas said nothing. He lay completely still and watched. At 11:41 the shape moved. Not walking. Not pacing. It leaned. Slowly, with deliberate purpose, it tilted forward, the shadow elongating and changing shape, until it was as if something had pressed its face against the door from outside, as if it was very close to the crack under the door looking in. Atlas's blanket was over his chin. He had not moved. And then the shadow spoke. The voice was low and it came from directly under the door and it said, clearly and without hurry, as if it had been waiting to say it for some time, "Your parents can't see me because I'm only here for you." Atlas did not scream. He did not move. He lay perfectly still under his blanket with his eyes very wide and his heart going at a speed he had not previously known his heart was capable of, and he waited. For what, he did not know. For the sound of his parents' door, for a creak in the hallway, for any sign that he was not alone in being awake in this house. The shadow was still there. the voice did not speak again. At some point, he did not know when, Atlas fell asleep. In the morning he told his parents everything. His mother, Anastasia Vane, listened with the careful expression of someone weighing what they are hearing against what they want to believe, and then she told him it was a dream, that he had fallen asleep while watching the door and the shadow and the voice had been part of that. His father said the same thing, gently, reasonably, in the way his father said things. Atlas considered this. He was a logical child. He could not entirely rule it out. But that night, when he went to bed, he put a towel along the base of his door to block the light from the hallway. The shadow appeared anyway. On the other side of the towel, pressed flat against the floor, the shape of something crouching. Atlas stared at it. It did not speak that night, or the night after. It simply appeared at 11:37 and crouched at his door and waited. By the third week, Atlas had stopped telling his parents about it. Not because they were unkind or dismissive. They were neither. But because he had begun to understand, in the quiet processing way of children, that whatever was outside his door at night was not something that could be addressed by his parents. It was not a parent problem. It had said so itself. Your parents can't see me, because I'm only here for you. Atlas grew up. He moved out of that house at 18 and went to university in Manchester and built a life. He did well. He was happy largely. He was still, in many ways, a logical person. Someone who valued evidence and reason and explanations that held together under scrutiny. But he never again slept with light showing under his door. In every house, every apartment, every hotel room, he blocked the gap. A towel, a rolled blanket, a draft excluder, whatever was available. His partners over the years asked about it, and he said it was a habit from childhood without elaborating. Because he was not entirely sure the shadow had stayed in that house. He was not entirely sure it had ever been in the house at all. Rather than in some property of the space between light and dark that exists under every door, in every room, in every house where a child is awake past 11:37. Waiting. Patient. Absolutely certain that eventually, someone would be only theirs. Thank you so much for watching, and for making it all the way through these 30 stories with me. That means more than you know, and I hope at least one of these stories kept the lights on for you tonight. I would love to hear from you in the comments. Which story was your favorite? Which one got under your skin the most? Was it the cornfield, the train, the red door? Or was it that shadow at the end of story 30 that you are still thinking about? Tell me in the comments below, and also tell me, what time are you watching this? Midnight? 3 in the morning? I genuinely love knowing. There is something about knowing there are people all over the world in the dark listening to stories like these. It makes this whole thing feel real. And if you have your own true story, something that happened to you or someone you know that you cannot explain, please share it in the comments or send it to our email. Your stories matter, and some of them are more terrifying than anything I could write. Now, if you are one of the viewers who watched this whole video without subscribing yet, I see you. I always see you. Hit that subscribe button, leave a like, click the bell so you never miss a new video. It genuinely helps this channel more than you know. And finally, tell me in the comments what topic you want next. More cave stories? Haunted houses? True crime that crosses into something unexplainable? Sleep paralysis? I read every comment, and your suggestions shape what comes next. Until next time, keep the lights on. Or don't. I'll leave that to you. Good night, sweet dreams.